Imagine a world where a single spark of rebellion ignites a revolution that reshapes an entire nation, challenging centuries of oppression. What if the fight for freedom was just the beginning of a struggle that would echo through time, inspiring generations to come? The relationship between the American colonies and Great Britain was once based on mutual benefit and a shared sense of colonial loyalty. For many years, the British provided protection and economic opportunity for the colonies, while the colonies supplied raw materials and contributed to the wealth of the British Empire. However, as the years passed, tensions began to rise, and the bond between the two grew increasingly strained. A major factor in the growing tension was the British government's increasing interference in colonial affairs. After the costly French and Indian War, Britain found itself deeply in debt and sought ways to raise revenue. To do this, they turned to their colonies, imposing taxes like the Stamp Act of 1765, the Sugar Act, and later the Townshend Acts, which were all viewed as unfair by the colonists. These taxes were seen as a direct violation of the colonies' rights, as they had no representation in Parliament to have a say in such matters. The colonists, led by vocal figures such as Patrick Henry and Samuel Adams, began to resist these taxes, calling for boycotts of British goods and forming groups like the Sons of Liberty. The phrase, "no taxation without representation," became a rallying cry for many Americans, symbolizing their frustration with a government that imposed laws without considering their input. Things escalated further when the British soldiers stationed in the colonies to enforce these laws began to clash with the local population. The Boston Massacre in 1770 was a turning point, as British soldiers killed 5 colonists during a protest, inflaming public sentiment and fueling anti-British sentiment. The subsequent Boston Tea Party in 1773, when American colonists disguised as Native Americans dumped British tea into Boston Harbor in protest of the Tea Act, was another powerful act of defiance that enraged the British government. In response, the British passed the Intolerable Acts in 1774, aimed at punishing the colonies, particularly Massachusetts, for their actions. These laws closed the port of Boston, restricted local government, and allowed British soldiers to be housed in colonists' homes. These measures further united the colonies in their resistance to British rule. By this point, the American colonies were on the brink of rebellion. The idea of independence was beginning to take root. The First Continental Congress met in 1774 to discuss their grievances and determine a collective course of action. Tensions were high, but the colonies still hoped for reconciliation. However, as British forces moved into Massachusetts in the spring of 1775, the first shots of the Revolution were fired at Lexington and Concord. This marked the beginning of open conflict between the colonies and Britain, with the seeds of revolution now firmly planted. The French and Indian War, fought between 1754 and 1763, was a pivotal conflict that deeply affected the relationship between the American colonies and Great Britain. The war was part of the larger struggle between European powers for control of North America, with the British fighting against the French and their Native American allies. For the colonies, the war was costly, both in terms of lives lost and resources drained. Thousands of colonists enlisted in the British military effort, and many others were directly affected by the fighting that spread throughout the frontier regions. Though the war was technically a British victory, it left the empire in severe financial distress. The British government, already burdened with debt from previous wars, found itself in need of funds to maintain control over the newly acquired territories. To deal with this debt, the British government turned its attention to the colonies, expecting them to contribute more to the cost of their own defence and governance. In the wake of the war, the British imposed a series of taxes and regulations on the American colonies, beginning with the Sugar Act in 1764. This was followed by the Stamp Act of 1765, which required colonists to pay taxes on a wide range of printed materials. These measures were the first direct taxes on the colonies, and they quickly provoked outrage. The colonists, who had long enjoyed a certain degree of autonomy and had been accustomed to relatively light taxation, were infuriated by what they saw as unjust and unconstitutional measures. They had no representation in the British Parliament, and yet they were being taxed without their consent. This breach of their perceived rights stirred resentment and calls for resistance. The British government, however, was firm in its stance. They argued that the colonies were part of the British Empire and, as such, should share in the financial burden of the empire's defence. But the taxes were not simply about raising revenue. They were also about asserting British authority over the colonies. The British believed that by taxing the colonies, they could strengthen their control and remind the colonists of their subordinate position within the empire. The colonial reaction was swift and forceful. Protests erupted in cities like Boston, and organizations like the Sons of Liberty emerged to coordinate resistance efforts. The phrase, "no taxation without representation," became a rallying cry, symbolizing the colonists' demand for a voice in the decisions that directly affected their lives. Boycotts of British goods became widespread, and colonists began to question their loyalty to the Crown. By the time the British repealed the Stamp Act in 1766, the damage had been done. The war, which had initially been a unifying force for the colonies, had now become a catalyst for growing divisions between the colonies and the British government. The British debt and the taxes that followed were just the beginning of a series of policies that would eventually lead the colonies down the path of rebellion and, ultimately, revolution. The French and Indian War, while securing British dominance in North America, set in motion the events that would unravel the relationship between Britain and its American colonies. In 1765, the British Parliament passed the Stamp Act, a law that required the American colonies to purchase a stamp for every printed document, including newspapers, legal papers, and even playing cards. The purpose of the Stamp Act was to raise funds to pay off the immense debt Britain had accumulated during the French and Indian War. While the British government saw the act as a reasonable measure to offset the costs of defending the colonies, the colonists saw it as an overreach of British authority and a direct assault on their liberties. The Stamp Act marked the first time that the British government had imposed a direct tax on the colonies, rather than relying on trade regulations and duties. This shift in policy sent shockwaves through the colonies. The taxes were not only a financial burden, but they also signaled a growing interference in the daily lives of the colonists, who had long enjoyed a relatively high degree of autonomy. The colonists felt that the British government had no right to impose such a tax without their consent, especially given that they had no representation in the British Parliament. Colonial resistance to the Stamp Act was swift and widespread. The colonies quickly organized protests, and many of the colonies convened the Stamp Act Congress in New York in October 1765. Delegates from 9 colonies met to discuss their response to the new law. The Congress issued a Declaration of Rights and Grievances, asserting that only colonial assemblies, not Parliament, had the authority to levy taxes on the colonies. This document was a crucial early step in the development of colonial unity and resistance to British rule. In addition to the formal political response, street protests erupted in many cities. The Sons of Liberty, a group of colonial activists, became the face of this resistance, leading demonstrations and intimidating stamp distributors. In some cases, the protests turned violent, with effigies of British officials being burned and British goods being boycotted. The message was clear: the colonies would not accept the Stamp Act, and they would fight to preserve their rights as Englishmen. At the heart of the colonial resistance was the concept of no taxation without representation. The phrase became a rallying cry for colonists who felt they were being unfairly taxed by a government in which they had no voice. To the colonists, the idea that they could be taxed without their consent was a violation of their natural rights. This sentiment was rooted in the British tradition of representative government, where people could only be taxed by a legislature in which they were represented. The British government, however, did not fully grasp the depth of colonial anger. Parliament, led by figures like Prime Minister George Grenville, believed that the colonies should contribute to the costs of the empire. They thought the taxes were reasonable, especially given the colonists' prosperity and the protection they received from the British military. But the idea that the colonies were being taxed without their consent struck at the heart of their identity and their relationship with Britain. As the protests grew, so did the pressure on Britain to repeal the Stamp Act. The economic boycotts, combined with the outcry from merchants in Britain who were affected by the colonial resistance, made it clear that the act was not sustainable. In 1766, less than a year after it was enacted, the British government repealed the Stamp Act. However, the damage had already been done. The colonists had tasted the power of collective resistance, and the notion of no taxation without representation would continue to shape their relationship with Britain, laying the groundwork for the eventual struggle for independence. In 1767, following the repeal of the Stamp Act, the British government, eager to maintain its control over the colonies, passed a new set of laws known as the Townshend Acts. These laws were designed to raise revenue by imposing duties on a variety of everyday goods, including paper, glass, lead, paint, and tea. Unlike the Stamp Act, which was a direct tax on paper documents, the Townshend duties were indirect, levied on imported goods before they reached the colonies. The British believed this would make the taxes less offensive to the colonists, who had grown increasingly resistant to direct taxation. However, the colonies were quick to see the Townshend Acts as another form of British overreach and a violation of their rights. The Townshend Acts aimed to raise revenue for Britain, but they also sought to assert British authority over the colonies by using the funds to pay royal governors and judges in America, thus making them less dependent on colonial assemblies for their salaries. This move further alienated the colonists, who saw it as an attempt to undermine their self-governance. In addition to these financial motives, the Townshend Acts also expanded the powers of British customs officials, granting them the right to search colonial homes and businesses without a warrant in order to enforce the new taxes. This erosion of privacy rights sparked widespread outrage in the colonies. Colonial resistance to the Townshend Acts was immediate and fierce. The leaders of the colonies, who had already been galvanized by the Stamp Act, now began organizing boycotts of British goods. Merchants and consumers alike were urged to stop importing and buying British goods, particularly luxury items like tea, which had long been a staple of colonial society. The boycott was a powerful tool of protest, as it directly affected British trade and merchant profits, making it clear that the colonists were unwilling to accept these new taxes. In addition to boycotts, colonial assemblies issued resolutions condemning the Townshend Acts. The Massachusetts Circular Letter, written by Samuel Adams, was one such declaration. It urged the colonies to unite in opposition to the new taxes and to refuse to comply with the British-imposed duties. The letter was widely circulated and gained the support of many other colonies, including New York and Virginia. The coordinated resistance brought the colonies closer together as they realized that their liberties were under threat from the British government, and only through solidarity could they protect their rights. The British response to the colonial protests was to send more troops to the colonies, particularly to Boston, where unrest was most pronounced. Tensions between the British soldiers and the colonists continued to rise, leading to incidents of violence, such as the Boston Massacre in 1770. Despite the presence of British troops and the government's heavy-handed tactics, the boycott movement was largely successful. British merchants, who had been hit hard by the loss of colonial trade, lobbied Parliament for the repeal of the Townshend duties. In 1770, Britain finally relented and repealed most of the Townshend duties, except for the tax on tea. Although the repeal of the Townshend Acts temporarily eased tensions, it did not resolve the fundamental issues between Britain and its American colonies. The colonists remained deeply resentful of British interference in their affairs, and the struggle for independence was far from over. The Townshend Acts had set the stage for a more intense confrontation, one that would ultimately lead to the American Revolution. In the winter of 1770, tensions in Boston reached a boiling point. The city, already a hotbed of colonial dissent, had been simmering under the weight of British occupation and the recent Townshend Acts. The presence of British soldiers in Boston, meant to enforce the unpopular taxes, only fueled the growing animosity between the colonists and the Crown. On March 5, 1770, the tension would erupt into violence, forever altering the course of American history. The incident, which would come to be known as the Boston Massacre, began when a crowd of colonists gathered outside the Custom House, where British soldiers were stationed to enforce customs duties. The crowd, already hostile toward the soldiers, began jeering and throwing insults, and tensions quickly escalated. The colonists, frustrated by their increasing economic hardships and the heavy-handed British presence, began throwing snowballs and other debris at the soldiers. The soldiers, already on edge and outnumbered, were ordered to stand their ground. Amid the chaos, a shot rang out, followed by several others. In the blink of an eye, 5 colonists were dead and others were wounded. The Boston Massacre was more than just a violent clash between soldiers and civilians. It was a pivotal moment that deepened the rift between the colonies and Britain. News of the massacre spread quickly, and colonial leaders were quick to frame it as an example of British tyranny. To the colonists, it was not just a tragedy, it was an act of murder, committed by an oppressive government that was willing to use force to suppress dissent. The incident fueled the growing sense that British rule was not only unjust but also increasingly violent and repressive. In the aftermath of the massacre, the protests grew even more intense. The anger that had been building for years found a powerful outlet in the outrage over the deaths of the 5 colonists. The incident galvanized public sentiment against the British, particularly in New England, where the feeling of resistance was already strong. The Sons of Liberty, a group of radical patriots, seized the opportunity to use the massacre as a rallying cry. They organized mass protests, called for the removal of British troops from the colonies, and further pushed the narrative that British oppression had gone too far. The massacre became a symbol of the broader struggle for American rights and freedoms. As the protests spread, the divide between the colonists and Britain grew even more pronounced. British authorities, on the other hand, struggled to contain the fallout from the massacre. In an attempt to placate the colonists, British officials eventually withdrew some of the British troops stationed in Boston. However, the damage had already been done. The massacre, as it came to be called, served as a powerful propaganda tool for the colonists, inflaming passions and further deepening the divide. It was one more step in the escalating conflict that would soon culminate in the American Revolution. In 1773, Britain, eager to shore up its struggling East India Company, passed the Tea Act, a move that would provoke one of the most iconic acts of resistance in American history. The Tea Act was not a direct tax on the colonists, but rather a measure that gave the British East India Company a monopoly on tea sales in the American colonies. It allowed the company to sell tea directly to the colonies, bypassing colonial merchants and effectively undercutting the local economy. Though the tea was sold at a lower price, the Act retained the Townshend tax on tea, which had been one of the most despised elements of British policy. For many colonists, the Tea Act was yet another example of British overreach, an infringement on their rights and economic independence. While some colonists were willing to accept the lower prices, many viewed it as a subtle attempt to establish the principle that Britain could tax the colonies at will. The resentment was immediate. In cities like New York and Philadelphia, colonial merchants refused to allow the tea to be unloaded from ships. Protests and demonstrations erupted in response, with calls for non-importation and non-consumption of British goods. In Boston, the resistance to the Tea Act was especially fierce. The British government had chosen the city as one of the key points for distributing the tea, a move that only heightened tensions between the colonists and the British authorities. As the tea-laden ships arrived in Boston Harbor, a showdown loomed. The royal governor of Massachusetts, Thomas Hutchinson, insisted that the ships be unloaded and the taxes paid, despite the growing opposition. On the night of December 16, 1773, a group of colonists, disguised as Mohawk Indians to conceal their identities, boarded the ships. In an act of defiance and symbolizing their resistance to British rule, they dumped 342 chests of tea, valued at around £10 into the harbour. The Boston Tea Party, as it became known, was a bold and direct challenge to British authority. It was not just a protest against a specific tax, but a powerful statement that the colonies would no longer accept British interference in their affairs. The Boston Tea Party sent shockwaves throughout both Britain and the American colonies. British authorities responded swiftly and harshly, implementing what would become known as the Coercive Acts, or the Intolerable Acts. These laws closed Boston Harbor, dissolved local government, and placed Massachusetts under direct British control, among other punitive measures. Rather than quelling dissent, however, these acts only intensified the resolve of the colonists. Across the colonies, the Tea Party was celebrated as a heroic act of defiance, and the harsh British retaliation united the colonies in a shared sense of injustice. The consequences of the Boston Tea Party were far-reaching. It marked a significant escalation in the conflict between the American colonies and Britain, setting the stage for the First Continental Congress and the eventual outbreak of the American Revolution. The Tea Party was not just an act of protest, but a defining moment in the American struggle for self-determination and independence. In 1774, the British government, enraged by the defiance shown during the Boston Tea Party, took swift and severe action, passing a series of laws designed to punish Massachusetts and tighten British control over the colonies. These laws, known as the Coercive Acts, or as they were more commonly called by the colonists, the Intolerable Acts, were intended to break the back of colonial resistance. The British sought to reassert authority by inflicting significant punishment on the rebellious colonists, particularly those in Massachusetts. The first and most devastating of these measures was the closing of Boston Harbor until the destroyed tea was paid for. This act struck at the heart of the colony's economy, as the port of Boston had been a critical hub for trade and commerce. The closure left many merchants and laborers without work, pushing the already tense situation to the brink. Without access to their primary trading route, the colonists were faced with mounting hardship, further inflaming their resentment towards British authority. Alongside this, the Massachusetts Government Act altered the colony's charter, severely limiting local self-government. Town meetings, once a vibrant part of New England's political life, were restricted, and the royal governor gained the power to appoint most of the officials. This essentially wiped out the local autonomy that had been a key feature of the colonial system, making Massachusetts a puppet of the British Crown. The Administration of Justice Act allowed British officials accused of crimes in the colonies to be tried in Britain or Canada, rather than in the colonies themselves. This measure was designed to ensure that British officials were never held accountable for their actions in the colonies, further alienating the colonists who felt they were being treated as subjects rather than citizens with rights. Finally, the Quartering Act was expanded to allow British troops to be housed in private homes, even in times of peace. This was seen as an infringement on personal liberties and an intimidation tactic, as it placed British soldiers directly within colonial households, where they could be seen as both a physical and psychological force of control. The British response, far from quelling dissent, ignited a firestorm of resistance across the colonies. The Intolerable Acts were seen as a direct attack on colonial rights and freedoms. Colonists from different regions, previously divided by geography, economy, and even political philosophy, began to unite in opposition. The Massachusetts colony, in particular, became a rallying point for protests, but soon other colonies followed suit, offering support to their fellow colonists in their time of need. By the time the First Continental Congress convened in September 1774, colonial unity had reached a new high. Representatives from 12 of the 13 colonies gathered in Philadelphia, not just to discuss the Intolerable Acts, but to create a coordinated response to British tyranny. This unity, in the face of oppression, marked a critical turning point in colonial history. The Intolerable Acts, rather than isolating Massachusetts, helped to forge a sense of shared identity among the colonies. It set the stage for further resistance, culminating in the outbreak of the American Revolution just 2 years later. The British, by attempting to tighten their grip, had unwittingly set in motion the events that would lead to their own loss of control over the colonies. The colonists, in their unity and resolve, had found not just a common cause, but the strength to challenge British authority. In the fall of 1774, 12 of the 13 American colonies came together in Philadelphia to address the escalating tensions with Britain. The First Continental Congress marked a pivotal moment in the struggle for colonial rights and set the stage for a united response to the growing British crackdown. For the first time, representatives from the different colonies, despite their diverse backgrounds and interests, came together with a common purpose: to assert their rights and demand that the British government reverse the oppressive measures imposed by the Intolerable Acts. The delegates to the Congress were a mix of experienced politicians, such as John Adams, Patrick Henry, and George Washington, and younger, less experienced men, all driven by a deep sense of grievance against Britain's treatment of the colonies. The Congress convened in response to the closing of Boston Harbor and the widespread perception that the British were stripping the colonies of their hard-won rights. The representatives, though not yet openly advocating for independence, were increasingly determined to resist Britain's growing control. One of the key outcomes of the Congress was the formation of the Continental Association, a unified response to the British policies. This was a system of economic boycotts designed to cripple British commerce and force Parliament to reconsider its actions. The association called for a complete halt to trade with Britain and its colonies until the Intolerable Acts were repealed. It also encouraged the colonies to create local committees to enforce the boycott and to resist the enforcement of the acts. These committees would become vital in maintaining the unity of the resistance and organizing local protests against British rule. In addition to the economic boycott, the Congress also took steps to prepare for potential military action. While still hoping to resolve the situation peacefully, the delegates recognized that Britain was unlikely to back down without a fight. They agreed to form a continental militia and encouraged the colonies to begin training their own troops in preparation for possible conflict. Though the Congress was still not yet openly calling for independence, it was clear that the colonies were beginning to take concrete steps towards self-defense and self-governance. The creation of the Continental Association was an act of defiance against Britain and demonstrated the colonies' growing sense of unity and resolve. The Congress also sent a petition to King George III, outlining the colonies' grievances and requesting a redress of their complaints. However, the king, who had already shown a disregard for colonial concerns, ignored the petition. The rejection of the petition only solidified the determination of the colonies to stand together and take further action. The First Continental Congress was a crucial step in the evolution of the American Revolution. It was not yet an overt call for independence, but it laid the groundwork for the collective action that would soon lead to war. Through the formation of the Continental Association and the creation of a united front, The colonies demonstrated their ability to come together and take decisive action in the face of British tyranny. The Congress had shown that the colonies could no longer afford to remain passive subjects. They would soon be forced into direct conflict with the British Empire. In the early hours of April 1775, the quiet of the Massachusetts countryside was shattered by the sound of gunfire. It was a sound that would mark the beginning of the American Revolutionary War. British troops, on a mission to seize colonial arms and arrest key leaders, clashed with the colonial militias in the towns of Lexington and Concord. What began as a small skirmish quickly escalated into a full-scale conflict, forever altering the relationship between Britain and its American colonies. The British had set out from Boston with orders to disarm the colonists and arrest leaders such as Samuel Adams and John Hancock, who were seen as radical threats to British authority. But the colonists were prepared. In the days leading up to the confrontation, the colonial militias had been receiving intelligence from a network of spies and messengers, including the famous ride of Paul Revere. Revere and others had warned that the British were coming, allowing local militias to mobilize in defense of their homes and weapons. As the British troops marched toward Lexington, a small band of colonial militia, numbering about 70 men, stood ready to face them. The confrontation occurred on the village green, where the British soldiers demanded the militia disperse. Tensions were high, and then, suddenly, a shot rang out. Historians still debate which side fired the first shot, but it was this single moment that triggered the larger conflict. The British troops returned fire, killing 8 colonists and wounding several others before pushing forward to Concord. The battles at Lexington and Concord were not just a military clash, they were a clear sign that the colonies were no longer willing to submit to British rule. The British, expecting to disarm a disorganized group of rebels, were met with fierce resistance from the colonial militias. As the British made their way to Concord, they encountered more armed colonists determined to protect their supplies. At the North Bridge in Concord, a larger group of militias stood their ground. The British soldiers, unable to continue their mission, were forced to retreat, and as they marched back toward Boston, they were harassed and attacked by colonial fighters from behind trees and stone walls. What followed was a full-scale retreat back to Boston, with the British soldiers under constant fire. The news of the battles spread quickly, and within days, tens of thousands of colonists had mobilized, prepared to fight for their independence. The events at Lexington and Concord were not just the first shots of war, they were the spark that ignited the revolution. The colonists had shown that they were no longer passive subjects of the British Crown, but a people willing to take up arms to defend their rights. The Revolutionary War had begun, and there would be no turning back. The struggle for independence had moved from the halls of protest to the battlefields of war. After the battles of Lexington and Concord, the stage was set for the first full-scale military confrontation of the American Revolutionary War. By May 1775, as the British retreated to the safety of Boston, the colonial militias quickly organized into the Continental Army under the command of General George Washington. The siege of Boston began in earnest as the colonial forces surrounded the city, cutting off the British troops stationed there from any supplies or reinforcements. Boston, then a major British stronghold in New England, was now effectively isolated. British General Thomas Gage, who commanded the forces in the city, found himself in a precarious position. The colonial forces had surrounded Boston on land, while the British Navy controlled the harbour, making any escape or reinforcements difficult. The city was teeming with British troops, but they were now trapped, unable to break the colonial lines or obtain much-needed supplies. In the early days of the siege, skirmishes broke out regularly as both sides tested the limits of their positions. The colonial forces, though less experienced and poorly equipped, showed remarkable determination. They fired on British troops from strategic positions, often from behind stone walls, trees, and buildings, making it clear that they were no longer mere rebels, but an organized army. The British, on the other hand, though well-trained and armed, found themselves in an increasingly difficult situation. Their efforts to break the siege were unsuccessful, and every move they made was met with resistance. The skirmishes around Boston had a profound impact on both sides. For the British, the constant pressure highlighted the limitations of their military strategy. They were accustomed to fighting in traditional European-style battles, but the colonists fought in a far more unconventional manner. This gave the colonial militias a psychological advantage, despite their smaller numbers and lack of resources. The British forces, though more powerful, were slowly being worn down by persistent attacks and the realization that they were trapped in a city they could not escape without risking further casualties. For the colonial forces, the siege of Boston was a critical moment of unity and resolve. It demonstrated that they could organize effectively and maintain a prolonged military campaign. The skirmishes also served to boost morale, as the colonies saw that they could stand up to the might of the British Empire. Despite their lack of formal training and supplies, the colonists fought with the fierce determination of men defending their homes and freedoms. As the siege continued, the impact of these early skirmishes was felt on both sides. For the British, it was a reminder that this was no longer a distant rebellion, but a full-scale conflict. For the colonists, it was a taste of what was to come, a war that would demand everything they had. The siege of Boston marked the beginning of a long, arduous struggle, but it also set the tone for what would become the heart of the Revolution. A battle for independence and self-determination. The Battle of Bunker Hill, fought on June 17, 1775, would prove to be one of the most significant early battles of the American Revolution. The conflict took place on Breed's Hill, overlooking the strategic port of Boston, and though it would later be remembered as a costly British victory, its true importance lay in the newfound confidence it inspired in the colonial forces. The British troops, led by General William Howe, had already been besieged in Boston, and they knew that they needed to break the colonial siege and restore control over the region. The colonists, recognizing the British vulnerability, seized the opportunity to fortify the high ground around Boston. As the British advanced to dislodge the colonial forces, they encountered stiff resistance from the well-positioned patriots who had dug in behind earthworks and barricades. The British initially underestimated the resolve of the colonists, thinking they would easily displace the militias. But the colonial fighters, bolstered by the idea of defending their homes and freedom, held their ground with an unexpected ferocity. Time and again, they repelled British assaults, inflicting heavy casualties on the redcoats. However, the colonists were not without their own struggler. Supplies were limited, and ammunition grew scarce. Despite their determination, they were eventually overwhelmed by the British, who, after 3 brutal assaults, managed to take control of the hill. Yet, for all the British success in capturing the hill, the battle was a Pyrrhic victory. They had suffered devastating losses. Over 0 casualties, including many officers, while the colonial forces, though forced to retreat, had far fewer wounded and dead. The battle exposed the British Army's vulnerability, as the colonists fought with skill and resilience that belied their lack of formal training. This fact was not lost on either side. The British commanders realized that the colonists would not be easily defeated, while the colonial forces recognized that they had the ability to stand against one of the most powerful armies in the world. In the aftermath of the battle, despite the tactical loss, the morale of the colonial forces soared. They had proven their mettle on the battlefield, and the victory was not just in holding the hill but in what it symbolized. The colonists could, and would, stand up to the British. This battle marked a turning point in the war, as the colonists gained a sense of unity and resolve that would fuel their resistance in the years to come. Even as the smoke of the battle cleared and the British stood victorious, the true cost of that victory would weigh heavily on them, for they had awakened a spirit of rebellion that would be impossible to extinguish. The battle may have been lost, but the war for independence had taken a decisive step forward. In the wake of the Battle of Bunker Hill and the intensifying conflict with Britain, the Continental Congress took the decisive step of formalizing the colonial militias into a unified force, the Continental Army. The newly appointed Commander-in-Chief, George Washington, a man of considerable military experience from the French and Indian War, was tasked with the monumental challenge of leading a diverse and often disorganized force of volunteers. Washington's selection was not a coincidence. He was seen as a symbol of unity, a figure who could transcend regional divides and inspire confidence in both the Congress and the colonial militias. Washington arrived in Cambridge, Massachusetts, in the summer of 1775 to take command of an army that was far from the disciplined, cohesive force he would need. The Continental Army was a motley collection of soldiers, most of them untrained, ill-equipped, and poorly supplied. Their morale was low, particularly after the recent losses at Bunker Hill, and many of the men were eager to return home, having only enlisted with the expectation of short-term service. Washington knew that his first priority had to be instilling discipline and fostering a sense of unity among these disparate groups of fighters. He had to transform them from a collection of militias into a true army capable of standing up to the British military. Despite Washington's leadership, the army faced significant challenges. The soldiers were plagued by shortages of everything from food to proper clothing, let alone the arms and ammunition needed to defend against a superior British force. The winter of 1776 was particularly harsh, and desertion became a serious problem. The Continental Army was chronically underfunded, with the Congress struggling to raise enough money to support its troops. The soldiers endured long periods of inactivity, often with little to do except stand watch and wait for orders. The early months of the war were a test of patience and endurance, as the soldiers grappled with the realization that this would not be a quick or easy fight. Morale continued to fluctuate as the army dealt with poor living conditions, inadequate supplies, and the harsh New England winter. The lack of formal training among many of the soldiers only added to the difficulty, as Washington worked tirelessly to instill a sense of military discipline and focus. Yet, despite these many hardships, there was also a growing sense of camaraderie and purpose among the men. They knew they were fighting for a cause much larger than themselves, freedom from tyranny and the establishment of a new nation. Washington, ever the symbol of determination, refused to allow his soldiers to falter, constantly pushing forward in the face of adversity. As the year 1776 dawned, Washington's leadership began to bear fruit, and the Continental Army, though still fragile, had become a more organized and resilient force. Washington's ability to inspire his troops, despite the numerous challenges they faced, was a testament to his unyielding resolve. The army's struggles were far from over, but under his command, the Continental Army began to take shape, preparing for the long and grueling fight ahead. The push for independence from Great Britain had been steadily gaining momentum as tensions escalated over the past few years. The colonial resistance was no longer just about defending their rights as English subjects, but had evolved into a struggle for self-determination. By 1776, many Americans felt they could no longer remain under British rule, a sentiment shared across the colonies. The philosophical foundation for this shift had been brewing for decades, influenced by Enlightenment thinkers like John Locke, whose ideas on natural rights and the social contract helped frame the colonial argument for independence. Locke's notion that individuals had the right to life, liberty, and property, and that government's role was to protect these rights resonated deeply with colonists who felt their rights were being infringed upon by the British Crown. These ideas provided the intellectual backbone for the revolution and gave colonists a sense of moral clarity about the necessity of breaking away. The political landscape also demanded a bold move. The colonies had already been engaged in acts of defiance, and British attempts to tighten control through oppressive laws had only pushed the colonists closer to the idea of a complete break. In the spring of 1776, The Continental Congress, meeting in Philadelphia, reached the point of no return. After years of petitioning for redress and suffering under British policies, the delegates realized that a more radical solution was needed. It was no longer about seeking fair treatment within the empire, but about creating a new, independent nation. The task of crafting the formal Statement of Independence fell to Thomas Jefferson, a 33-year-old delegate from Virginia, who was tasked with writing a declaration that would explain to the world why the colonies were severing ties with Britain. Jefferson, deeply influenced by Enlightenment ideas, wrote with clarity and passion, drawing heavily from the works of Locke and other philosophers. His document not only outlined the philosophical justification for independence, but also detailed the numerous grievances the colonies had against King George III. Jefferson's writing was deliberate and powerful, aiming to both rally the colonists and win international support for the revolution. The Declaration of Independence, approved by the Continental Congress on July 4, 1776, was not just a list of complaints, it was a bold statement of principles that would lay the groundwork for a new nation. Jefferson's eloquent words, particularly the famous preamble, articulated the belief in equality and the right of people to govern themselves. The Declaration was an act of defiance and a call for unity among the colonies, while simultaneously challenging the legitimacy of British rule. It marked a decisive moment in American history, not only in the fight against British oppression, but in the birth of a nation founded on the ideals of liberty and justice. The Declaration of Independence was more than a document, it was a manifesto of freedom and a signal to the world that America was ready to chart its own course. The summer of 1776 brought with it a decisive moment in the prominent Revolutionary War. After the colonies declared independence, the British set their sights on New York City, recognizing it as a strategic hub. The British Army, led by General William Howe, landed on Long Island with the intention of isolating the rebellious colonies and quashing the revolution. Washington, aware of the significance of New York, prepared for battle with his Continental Army, but he was far from prepared for the overwhelming force the British brought to bear. The Battle of Long Island, also known as the Battle of Brooklyn, began on August 27, 1776, with both sides entrenched on opposite ends of the island. Washington's army, consisting of inexperienced troops, was outnumbered and outmaneuvered by the more seasoned British forces. Howe's strategy was to outflank the American positions, and by the second day of the battle, his forces had surrounded Washington's army. The British had superior numbers, training, and artillery, and their systematic assault pushed the Continental Army into a precarious position. Washington, recognizing the dire situation, ordered a retreat, but it was a close call. The American forces were nearly decimated, and New York City fell to the British soon after the battle. The loss was a blow to the morale of the Continental Army, but Washington's ability to pull off a successful nighttime retreat saved the army from complete annihilation. The retreat was a difficult decision, but one that proved to be essential in the long run. Washington's leadership was tested as the Continental Army faced numerous challenges. The loss of New York City was a major setback, and the British now controlled a crucial port that provided them with strategic access to supplies, reinforcements, and a foothold in the heart of the rebellion. Washington and his troops fled to Manhattan, then further to New Jersey, all while the British pursued relentlessly. The retreat stretched the resources of the Continental Army to their limits, and Washington had to deal with mounting frustrations and fears that his army might disband. The Continental Army was not just facing an external enemy, but was also grappling with internal issues such as insufficient supplies, lack of experienced leadership, and the harsh conditions of war. In the face of these challenges, morale was dangerously low, and many soldiers, fatigued and discouraged, began to question the cause they were fighting for. Washington's retreat marked a pivotal moment in the war, showing that even in defeat, strategic retreats could offer the promise of survival. Despite the loss, Washington's ability to keep the army intact and continue the fight would eventually prove to be crucial for the revolution's future success. In the harsh winter of 1776, as the Revolutionary War seemed to be spiraling toward defeat, a voice emerged that would ignite the flames of rebellion across the colonies. That voice belonged to Thomas Paine, an Englishman who had recently immigrated to America. Paine, a passionate writer with a gift for stirring emotion, understood the power of ideas in shaping public opinion. His pamphlet, Common Sense, published in January 1776, became an instant sensation, spreading through the colonies like wildfire. Paine's argument for independence from Britain was not just a political statement, it was a call to action. Paine's brilliance lay in his ability to take complex political ideas and present them in a language that was accessible to the common man. He framed the issue of independence in stark terms, making it clear that reconciliation with Britain was no longer possible. Paine boldly attacked the idea of monarchy, denouncing King George III as a tyrant who ruled unjustly over the American colonies. He argued that the colonies were capable of self-governance, free from the shackles of a distant, oppressive monarchy. For many colonists, Paine's words were a revelation, a powerful and persuasive argument that rallied them to the cause of independence. What made Common Sense so impactful was its timing. The colonies were in a state of uncertainty and fear. Washington's army had suffered defeats, and many Americans were questioning whether the struggle for independence was worth the cost. Paine's pamphlet gave them a sense of purpose and hope. He appealed to their desire for freedom and equality, presenting independence not as a distant ideal, but as a practical necessity for their survival and future prosperity. Paine argued that it was unnatural for a continent to be ruled by a distant island, and that it was time for America to take control of its own destiny. The pamphlet resonated deeply with ordinary colonists who had previously been ambivalent about the war. It gave voice to the frustrations of those who had felt the weight of British control, but were unsure how to articulate their desire for change. Paine's argument that the colonies were strong enough to govern themselves sparked a sense of pride and unity. His call for a republic, a government based on the will of the people, rather than the authority of a monarch, was a radical idea that would shape the future of the nation. Common Sense sold over 100,000 copies in just a few months, an extraordinary number for the time, and its influence cannot be overstated. It helped to galvanize public opinion in favor of independence, paving the way for the Continental Congress to adopt the Declaration of Independence later that year. Paine's pamphlet provided a philosophical and emotional foundation for the rebellion, turning the idea of independence from a radical notion into a widespread cause embraced by people across the colonies. In a time of uncertainty and despair, Paine's words gave the colonists the courage to push forward, fighting not just for their freedom, but for the promise of a new, self-determined future. On the night of December 25, 1776, George Washington made a bold decision that would change the course of the Revolutionary War. The Continental Army had been battered and demoralized, suffering a series of defeats and retreating from New York and New Jersey. The men were tired, hungry, and close to abandoning the cause. But Washington knew that victory was not just about winning battles, it was about restoring hope and faith in the struggle for independence. So, he planned an audacious attack against the Hessian forces, German mercenaries who had been stationed in Trenton, New Jersey. Washington's plan was to cross the Delaware River under the cover of night, a task made all the more difficult by the cold, ice-filled waters and a violent winter storm. The elements were against them, but Washington's army pressed on. As they crossed the river, the soldiers were exhausted and battered by the brutal conditions. Yet, Washington remained resolute. He knew that the attack, though risky, could not only deliver a much-needed victory, but also reinvigorate the spirits of his troops. By dawn on December 26, the Continental Army had reached Trenton, where the Hessians, unaware of the imminent attack, were still recuperating from their Christmas celebrations. The surprise was complete. Washington's men, despite their exhaustion, launched a swift and decisive assault on the unprepared Hessian forces. The battle was over quickly. Within about an hour, and the Continental Army captured nearly 0 prisoners, with little loss of their own men. It was a stunning victory, one that sent shockwaves through both the American and British forces. The success at Trenton had a profound effect on the morale of the Continental Army and the people of the colonies. Until then, the rebellion had seemed like a long shot, with Washington and his forces on the brink of collapse. But this victory breathed new life into the cause. The Continental Army, now emboldened, began to believe in the possibility of success, and Washington's leadership was reaffirmed. The victory at Trenton became a symbol of resilience, proving that even in the darkest of times, a bold and decisive strike could alter the course of events. The Battle of Trenton also marked a significant shift in momentum. It was not just a military victory, it was a psychological one. The success inspired a wave of enlistments as new recruits rushed to join the army, eager to be part of the struggle. Washington's bold decision to attack on Christmas night was seen as a brilliant tactical move, demonstrating that the Continental Army, under his command, could fight effectively and strategically. In the weeks that followed, Washington would go on to score another victory at the Battle of Princeton, further cementing the Army's renewed strength. Together, these victories marked a turning point in the Revolutionary War, shifting the momentum from British dominance to a sense of hope and possibility for the Americans. After the stunning success at the Battle of Trenton, Washington knew that the Continental Army needed to follow up with another victory to maintain the momentum. The Army had gained much-needed confidence, but the pressure was on to prove that their victory was not a fluke and that they could hold their ground against the powerful British forces. On January 3, 1777, Washington set his sights on Princeton, where British forces had regrouped after their defeat at Trenton. In the days leading up to the Battle of Princeton, Washington's army was still far from fully equipped, and the soldiers were struggling with fatigue and harsh winter conditions. Yet, Washington's leadership and the confidence gained from their triumph in Trenton inspired his men to press forward. They understood that a second victory was critical to the success of the revolution. The British forces under General Cornwallis were not far behind, and they were determined to retake Princeton and restore British control over New Jersey. Washington's strategy was daring and innovative. He left a small portion of his army behind in Trenton, lighting campfires to create the illusion of a large force still occupying the town. Meanwhile, the bulk of his troops quietly marched toward Princeton, planning a surprise attack. The British were caught off guard, as they had expected the Continental Army to be retreating or consolidating after their victory at Trenton. By the time the British realized what had happened, Washington's forces were already advancing toward Princeton. The battle itself was fierce and hard-fought. The Continental Army faced British regulars and Hessian mercenaries, but they fought with a renewed sense of purpose. As the American forces approached the British lines, they met with heavy resistance. The key moment in the battle came when Washington personally led his troops into the fray, urging them forward with his example. The Americans pushed the British back, and after hours of intense fighting, they were able to break the enemy's line and force them into retreat. The victory at Princeton had a profound impact on the course of the war. It was the first time the Continental Army had defeated a large British force in a set-piece battle, and it confirmed that the revolution was not just a passing moment of rebellion, but a sustained and serious challenge to British authority. The British were no longer invincible, and the Continental Army had shown that it could defeat them on the field of battle. The victory also helped to strengthen the morale of the colonial forces, showing them that they could win even against the formidable British Army. Washington's success at Princeton marked a critical turning point in the early stages of the Revolutionary War. It proved that the Continental Army, though still far from fully trained or equipped, was capable of taking on the British and emerging victorious. The victory also sparked new waves of enlistments and support from the colonies. For the first time, many Americans began to believe that independence was truly achievable. The Battle of Princeton, coming on the heels of the victory at Trenton, provided the spark that would sustain the Revolution in its most difficult years. Washington's leadership and the perseverance of his men had turned the tide, and the path to independence was now more firmly within reach. In the summer of 1777, British General John Burgoyne embarked on a bold and ambitious campaign aimed at dividing the American colonies along the Hudson River. His plan was to capture the strategically important town of Saratoga in upstate New York, thereby isolating the northern colonies from the rest and cutting off vital supply lines. Burgoyne's forces, a formidable combination of regular British troops, German mercenaries, and Native American allies, moved southward from Canada with high hopes of success. However, the campaign quickly became a costly and drawn-out affair that ultimately led to British failure and a turning point in the Revolutionary War. Burgoyne's advance was met with stiff resistance from the American forces, led by General Horatio Gates and Benedict Arnold. The Americans, who were increasingly unified by the desire for independence, mounted a determined defense. They used their knowledge of the terrain to their advantage, setting up fortifications and blocking British supply lines. Burgoyne's army, unable to resupply and reinforce as planned, found itself bogged down in the wilderness, struggling with exhaustion, hunger, and attrition. Despite initial success in capturing forts and pushing south, the British found themselves increasingly isolated and surrounded. The Battle of Saratoga, fought in two main engagements in September and October, became the decisive moment in Burgoyne's campaign. The American forces, despite being outnumbered, fought with unparalleled tenacity. As the British forces attempted to break through American lines, they were relentlessly pushed back. The Americans, with the help of reinforcements, effectively trapped Burgoyne's army. After days of fierce fighting, Burgoyne was forced to surrender his entire army on October 17, 1777, marking a significant defeat for the British and a stunning victory for the Americans. The victory at Saratoga was not only a crucial military success, but also had profound diplomatic consequences. The American victory convinced France, which had been secretly aiding the rebels, to formally enter the war as an ally of the United States. French support, both military and financial, provided a significant boost to the American cause and helped to tip the scales in favor of the revolutionaries. France's involvement also brought additional European powers into the conflict, further isolating Britain and stretching its resources thin. The Saratoga campaign was a turning point in the Revolutionary War, proving that the Americans were capable of defeating a well-trained British army in a major engagement. The British strategy of isolating the northern colonies had failed, and instead of crippling the rebellion, the defeat at Saratoga invigorated the American cause. It gave the colonists hope and a sense of legitimacy, while sending a clear message to the British that the war would not be easily won. Saratoga was not just a military victory, it was a diplomatic triumph that secured vital international support, and it remains one of the most important moments in the history of the American Revolution. In 1778, after the American victory at Saratoga, a turning point in the Revolutionary War, the United States secured an alliance that would prove to be crucial in their fight for independence, the Franco-American Alliance. Prior to Saratoga, France had been quietly supporting the American cause, sending supplies and money in an effort to weaken Britain, their longtime rival. However, after the success at Saratoga, the Americans had proven they could hold their own against the British military. This emboldened France to take a much more active role in the conflict, and the two nations signed a formal alliance in February of 1778, marking a significant shift in the war's dynamics. The Franco-American Alliance was not just a diplomatic agreement, it was a lifeline for the fledgling United States. France provided invaluable military support, including troops, generals, and naval resources, all of which were critical in leveling the playing field against the British. One of the most significant contributions was the French Navy, which helped counter British naval supremacy. With French warships joining the American forces, the British found it increasingly difficult to control the seas, which in turn hindered their ability to resupply their troops and maintain communication between Britain and its colonies. The French also sent experienced officers to assist in training the Continental Army. One of the most notable figures was Marquis de Lafayette, a young French aristocrat who quickly became a trusted general in George Washington's army. Lafayette's presence, along with the support of other French military experts, significantly improved the American forces' ability to fight and organize, especially in battles like those at Brandywine and Monmouth. French officers also provided vital knowledge of European-style warfare, which bolstered the Continental Army's strategy and discipline. In addition to military aid, France provided significant financial support to the American cause. The French government provided loans, as well as direct subsidies, helping to keep the American army well supplied and able to continue the war effort. The United States, without its own financial resources, would have struggled to maintain the war effort without France's assistance. The French government's financial backing allowed the Americans to continue fighting a protracted war, even as Britain ramped up its efforts to crush the rebellion. The formal alliance with France also had significant diplomatic ramifications. It alerted Britain that the war would no longer be confined to the colonies alone. With the French now openly involved, the global nature of the conflict was clear, and Britain faced the prospect of fighting a war on multiple fronts. This international dimension of the conflict helped shift the balance of power in favor of the Americans, who now had the backing of one of Europe's most powerful nations. The Franco-American alliance was instrumental in the success of the American Revolution. It not only provided vital resources and military support, but also strengthened the resolve of the American people, who now saw that they were not alone in their fight for independence. With France's support, the United States gained a fighting chance to defeat the British, and this alliance would continue to shape the war until its eventual conclusion in 1783. The winter of 1777–1778 at Valley Forge proved to be one of the most challenging and pivotal periods for the Continental Army. After a series of hard-fought battles, the American forces found themselves encamped at Valley Forge, a site just outside of Philadelphia, in the coldest months of the year. The soldiers endured extreme hardships as they faced not only the brutal winter conditions, but also a severe lack of supplies. Food was scarce, clothing inadequate, and shelter insufficient. Disease spread rapidly, claiming the lives of many soldiers, and morale reached its lowest point. The men of the Continental Army were physically exhausted and mentally worn from the unrelenting conditions and the ever-present threat of starvation. Yet, despite the suffering, Valley Forge became a turning point in the history of the American Revolution. Under the leadership of General George Washington, the Continental Army endured the winter and emerged stronger. One of the most significant factors in the revival of the army during this period was the arrival of Baron Friedrich von Steuben, a Prussian military officer who would leave an indelible mark on the army's transformation. Von Steuben's training regimen was demanding, but it was precisely what the soldiers needed to overcome their previous lack of discipline and cohesion. He introduced a structured system of drills, instilling a sense of order and professionalism within the ranks. He taught the soldiers basic tactics, such as how to march in formation, how to use their weapons effectively, and how to maintain discipline on the battlefield. The soldiers, once undisciplined and prone to disarray, were now molded into a more unified and efficient fighting force. The transformation at Valley Forge was not just physical but also psychological. As the soldiers drilled under von Steuben's guidance, their confidence began to rebuild. The discipline they gained through his training made them feel more capable, and their sense of unity as an army grew stronger. Despite the harshness of the winter, the army's spirit began to revive, and the men were no longer merely surviving, they were beginning to thrive, at least in their sense of purpose and resolve. By the time spring arrived, the Continental Army at Valley Forge had undergone a profound change. They were better trained, more cohesive, and more disciplined than ever before. They had emerged from the depths of suffering and deprivation, not only surviving but also gaining the skills and confidence they would need to continue the war. Washington, who had shared in the hardships of his men, found his army reinvigorated and prepared for the challenges ahead. The hardships of Valley Forge, though harrowing, proved to be a crucible that forged a stronger and more capable Continental Army that would go on to fight with renewed vigor in the battles to come. The Battle of Monmouth, fought in June of 1778, marked the first major test for the Continental Army after their grueling winter at Valley Forge. Having undergone rigorous training under Baron von Steuben, the soldiers of the Continental Army were now far more disciplined and organized than ever before. The battle, which took place in New Jersey, was not only a critical moment for the American cause, but also a demonstration of the Army's newfound capabilities. The British, under General Sir Henry Clinton, had been retreating from Philadelphia after abandoning the city in the face of the growing strength of the American forces. Washington, eager to strike a blow to the British as they made their way toward New York, saw an opportunity to challenge them at Monmouth. The battle began with an American attack, but soon the situation shifted when the British forces launched a counter-offensive, pushing the Americans back. At one point, the Continental Army appeared to be on the verge of defeat, but the presence of General Washington, along with the discipline instilled in the troops, turned the tide. As the battle raged on, Washington's leadership was vital. Though the British forces had superior numbers and artillery, the Americans held their ground. The newly trained soldiers, many of whom had previously lacked coordination, now fought as a more cohesive unit. They stood firm and fought back with newfound resolve, thanks in part to their enhanced training. The battlefield at Monmouth saw a clash of endurance, with both sides exchanging brutal volleys in the heat of the summer day. The pivotal moment in the battle came when General Charles Lee, initially tasked with leading the attack, began retreating under pressure. Washington, outraged by the retreat, personally rallied the troops, taking command and leading the army back into the fray. His personal bravery and resolve inspired the soldiers to follow suit. His presence on the battlefield was a reminder that the army had transformed from a ragtag collection of militia into a fighting force capable of standing toe-to-toe with the British. Although the battle ended in a tactical draw, it was an unmistakable victory in terms of morale for the Continental Army. The British were forced to continue their retreat, and the Americans had proven they could fight and hold their ground against the might of the British Army. More than the battlefield itself, the battle at Monmouth symbolized the transformation of the American forces. The soldiers, once demoralized and untrained, had become a cohesive and disciplined army, ready to continue the fight for independence. Washington's leadership and the army's perseverance in the heat of the battle signified that the American cause was not only surviving but thriving in the face of adversity. Monmouth was not a moment of victory in the traditional sense, but it was a critical milestone in the march toward independence. The role of naval power in the American Revolution was often underestimated, yet it became a crucial aspect of the struggle for independence. As the war progressed, the American and French navies worked together to challenge the mighty British fleet, which had dominated the seas for centuries. Despite their initial lack of resources and experienced sailors, the Americans began to show remarkable resilience at sea, gaining crucial victories that boosted morale and aided their broader efforts. One of the most celebrated figures in the American naval effort was John Paul Jones, a Scottish-born sailor who became a symbol of American courage and ingenuity. Jones had been serving in the Continental Navy for some time when he famously captured the British warship HMS Serapis in 1779. This battle, off the coast of England, is often cited as one of the most remarkable naval engagements of the entire conflict. Despite being outgunned and facing seemingly insurmountable odds, Jones and his crew fought fiercely, famously declaring, "I have not yet begun to fight," when asked to surrender. His victory over the Serapis was a significant moral and strategic triumph, showing that the Continental Navy could hold its own against the British, even in their home waters. The French Navy played an equally important role in the American fight for independence. After the victory at Saratoga, which convinced the French government of the American cause, France entered the war as an ally of the United States. The French brought with them not only financial aid and military support, but a formidable naval force. The combined French and American fleets began to challenge British control of the seas, particularly in the Caribbean and along the American eastern seaboard. In 1781, the naval battle at the Chesapeake Bay became a pivotal moment in the Revolution. French Admiral François-Joseph Paul de Grasse, with his fleet, joined forces with the American Continental Army, led by General George Washington and French General Rochambeau, to trap British General Cornwallis's army at Yorktown. The French fleet successfully blocked British reinforcements and escape routes, ensuring Cornwallis's surrender and effectively sealing the fate of the British in America. These naval victories, particularly Jones's daring exploits and the strategic French assistance, were instrumental in turning the tide of the war. They not only disrupted British supply lines, but also forced the British to divert resources from their primary land campaigns, thus alleviating some of the pressure on American forces. The role of the Navy in the Revolution demonstrated that the fight for independence was not only waged on land, but also on the seas. As the war drew to a close, the naval efforts of the Americans and their French allies had become a symbol of the new nation's growing strength and international partnerships. In 1778, the British changed their strategy in response to mounting difficulties in the northern colonies. After a series of setbacks, including the failure to capture key cities and the increasing influence of American and French forces, the British decided to shift their focus to the southern colonies, where they believed loyalist support was stronger. They hoped that by capturing the southern states and using them as a base, they could turn the tide of the war in their favor. The southern colonies had been less involved in the early phases of the conflict, and the British believed they could rally the large number of loyalists living in places like South Carolina, Georgia, and North Carolina. These colonies had a significant number of British sympathizers who were thought to be eager for the return of royal control. The British strategy was to exploit these divisions and use them to isolate the more rebellious northern colonies. Their military efforts would be focused on securing control of key ports and cities, while at the same time relying on loyalist militias to suppress any opposition. The initial successes in the south seemed to confirm the British hope. In 1780, British forces captured Charleston, South Carolina, one of the largest cities in the southern colonies, and began to establish a strong foothold. The British Army, led by General Charles Cornwallis, followed up with a series of victories, pushing the American forces into retreat. British control in the south seemed assured, and the tide of war appeared to be turning in favor of the British. However, the dynamics of warfare in the south began to shift in unexpected ways. The British underestimated the resilience of the American forces and the determination of the local population. The southern colonies, despite the British expectations, did not embrace British rule as the British had hoped. Instead, the Patriots launched a series of guerrilla campaigns led by commanders like Francis Marion, known as the Swamp Fox, who employed hit-and-run tactics to harass the British forces. These unconventional methods of warfare took a toll on the British, who were not accustomed to the slow, grinding nature of these smaller, localized battles. At the same time, the British found themselves overextended in the south. As they moved into the interior, they faced increasing resistance from American militias and local farmers who had a strong desire to preserve their independence. This made the British occupation more costly and difficult to maintain. The American forces, under commanders like Nathaniel Greene, took advantage of the British vulnerability and forced Cornwallis to retreat from the interior, culminating in the pivotal Battle of Cowpens in 1781. This defeat marked a significant turning point, leading to Cornwallis's eventual surrender at Yorktown later that year. The British Southern strategy, while initially successful, ultimately proved to be a costly miscalculation. The shifting dynamics in the Southern theatre revealed the difficulty of maintaining control over a large, hostile population and the limitations of British military tactics in this new form of warfare. This change in focus also played a key role in the eventual American victory in the war, as the British were stretched thin and the southern colonies became a battleground that further drained their resources and morale. The Battle of Camden, fought in August 1780, was one of the darkest moments for the Continental Army during the Revolutionary War. After a series of successes and the growing momentum from the southern campaigns, the American forces, under General Horatio Gates, faced off against British troops led by General Charles Cornwallis in South Carolina. Gates, who had achieved some notable victories earlier in the war, was sent to challenge British control in the South. But the outcome of the battle would reveal the deep vulnerabilities in the Continental Army. At Camden, the Continental Army was decisively defeated. The British forces, despite being outnumbered, were better disciplined, more experienced, and had superior tactics. The American soldiers, many of whom were unseasoned and ill-prepared for the battle, were overwhelmed. The harsh conditions on the battlefield only worsened the situation, as intense heat and poor supply lines added to the chaos. The American troops were routed in the most crushing way, and the defeat came at a tremendous cost. General Gates, the commander of the American forces, fled the battlefield in the face of the rout, leaving behind his troops to be massacred or captured by the British. The loss at Camden had a significant psychological impact on both the army and the nation. Morale among the Continental troops plummeted, as the defeat shattered the growing confidence that had been built through previous victories. The Americans had hoped that the southern colonies, with their large loyalist populations, would become the heart of their resistance. Instead, the battle showed how vulnerable they were, and the defeat left the British firmly in control of South Carolina and much of the Southern theatre. The aftermath of the Battle of Camden forced the Continental Army to take a step back. The loss not only exposed weaknesses in leadership and strategy, but also highlighted the pressing need for reinforcements. The defeat underscored the importance of proper training, discipline, and the necessity of experienced commanders. Following the battle, General Gates was replaced by General Nathaniel Greene, a more experienced and determined leader who would play a crucial role in turning the tide in the South. Despite the setback, the loss at Camden galvanized the Continental Army into action. The American forces were far from defeated. They began to regroup, rebuild, and prepare for the long fight ahead. The call for reinforcements and supplies went out, and soon, Greene's leadership would help organize a more effective and strategic campaign in the South. This battle, though a devastating loss, ultimately served as a catalyst for the revitalization of the American resistance. The necessity of learning from such defeats and the determination to carry on in the face of hardship would be crucial in the final years of the war. The Battle of Camden proved that while victories were important, resilience in the face of adversity was what truly defined the American struggle for independence. In the wake of the devastating loss at Camden, the American forces in the South were faced with a critical need for a new strategy. Traditional battlefield tactics had proven ineffective against the well-trained British Army, so the Continental Army began to adopt unconventional warfare strategies. The shift to guerrilla tactics, often conducted by small, highly mobile groups, would prove to be a game-changer in the Southern theatre. Leading the charge were figures like Francis Marion, known as the Swamp Fox, and Daniel Morgan, both of whom understood the terrain and the necessity of blending military action with local support. Marion, operating in the swamps and forests of South Carolina, specialized in surprise attacks, ambushes, and hit-and-run tactics. His ability to strike quickly, melt into the environment, and avoid direct confrontation made him a thorn in the side of the British forces. Similarly, Morgan's skill in leading irregular troops allowed him to employ strategies that made the best use of his force's flexibility and speed, often targeting British supply lines and smaller detachments. This form of warfare, relying on mobility and local knowledge, contrasted sharply with the traditional European-style warfare practiced by the British. The British forces, despite their superior numbers and training, found themselves increasingly vulnerable to these swift, elusive attacks. The impact of such tactics was compounded by the strong support from local militias and civilian populations who were sympathetic to the American cause. These militias were often composed of farmers, traders, and ordinary citizens who had first-hand knowledge of the terrain and could easily blend into the population. The significance of local support cannot be overstated. These militias provided crucial intelligence, supplies, and manpower, allowing the guerrilla fighters to operate with relative ease. The commitment of local populations to the American cause, often driven by a desire to resist British control over their land, was essential in sustaining the guerrilla campaigns. Without this widespread network of local support, the irregular forces would have struggled to maintain their operations. The success of these unconventional tactics was evident in the victories that began to accumulate in the South. One of the most notable of these was Morgan's victory at the Battle of Cowpens in January 1781, where his forces, using deceptive tactics and strategic positioning, decisively defeated a much larger British force. This victory, alongside Marion's harassing tactics, shifted the balance of power in the South, eroding British control and morale. Guerrilla warfare became a hallmark of the Southern campaign, forcing the British to spread their forces thin, unable to effectively control the vast rural areas. This strategy was not without its costs, as it often involved brutal reprisals against civilians and scorched earth tactics by the British. However, the resilience and resourcefulness of the American forces, bolstered by local militias and unconventional tactics, turned the tide in the South, laying the groundwork for the eventual British surrender at Yorktown. Ultimately, the success of guerrilla warfare in the South demonstrated the power of unconventional tactics and local support in turning the tide of a seemingly unwinnable conflict. The ingenuity and tenacity of figures like Marion and Morgan, along with the resolve of the civilian population, played a crucial role in securing American independence. The Battle of Kings Mountain, fought in October 1780, marked a pivotal moment in the American Revolution, particularly in the Southern theater. It was a battle that defied expectations and provided a much-needed victory for the Continental Army at a time when morale was low. The British strategy in the South had been to rally loyalist support among the Southern population, hoping to turn the tide of war by encouraging local militias to fight for the crown. This strategy led to the formation of a sizable loyalist force, but at Kings Mountain, this plan would ultimately backfire. The battle took place near the border of North and South Carolina, where a force of roughly 10 American militia, composed mainly of backcountry fighters from Virginia, North and South Carolina, and Georgia, confronted a loyalist force of about 100 men, led by Major Patrick Ferguson. Ferguson, a British officer, had been sent by the British to pacify the region and recruit loyalists, but his tactics threatening to burn homes and kill civilians who refused to join the loyalist cause had enraged many of the frontier settlers. This anger led to the formation of the militia that would go on to confront him at Kings Mountain. The American militia, despite being less formally trained than their British counterparts, displayed remarkable courage and tenacity in the battle. The rugged terrain and the American fighters' knowledge of it played a crucial role. They fought with a strategy that relied on their superior mobility and the use of the environment to their advantage. The battle was intense, with the Americans encircling the Loyalists on the mountain, forcing them into a tight space, with little opportunity to escape. The Loyalists were overwhelmed, and Ferguson himself was killed in the fighting. The victory at Kings Mountain was significant for several reasons. First, it shattered the myth of Loyalist dominance in the region, showing that the British were unable to secure reliable support from the southern colonists. The defeat of Ferguson's Loyalists effectively crippled the British efforts to rally the backcountry to their cause. Secondly, it provided a huge morale boost for the American forces and their allies. The victory was hard-earned and showed that the American militia, though often underestimated, could stand toe-to-toe with the British and their Loyalist allies. The significance of Kings Mountain went beyond the battlefield. The victory galvanized the American cause, proving that even in the face of setbacks, success was possible. It also set the stage for further successes in the South, eventually leading to the turning of the tide against the British in the region. The defeat of Ferguson and his Loyalist forces was a crucial blow to British strategy and helped spark a wave of American victories, culminating in the eventual British surrender at Yorktown. Kings Mountain, with its blend of courage, strategy, and determination, stands as a testament to the resilience of the American forces and their determination to secure independence. The Battle of Cowpens, fought on January 17, 1781, in South Carolina, stands as one of the most decisive and well-executed victories for the Continental Army during the Southern Campaign. The battle marked a critical turning point in the Revolutionary War, especially in the South, where the British forces had gained considerable momentum after their successes earlier in the conflict. The Continental Army, led by General Daniel Morgan, faced off against the British forces under Lieutenant Colonel Banastra Tarleton. What ensued would be a display of military brilliance that changed the course of the war in the region. Morgan, known for his tactical ingenuity, understood the importance of both his men's abilities and the terrain in which they would fight. His forces were composed primarily of militia units, which were often seen as unreliable by the British, but Morgan knew their strengths and played to them. He made the bold decision to set up his troops in 3 lines, each with specific roles in the battle. The first line, made up of militia, was to give a false impression of weakness and draw the British forces in. Once the British engaged, they would be met by a second line of regular Continental soldiers who would harass them and force them to stretch their lines. Finally, a third line of well-trained infantry stood ready to deliver a crushing blow if necessary. Tarleton, notorious for his aggressive and relentless tactics, took the bait. He rushed his troops toward what appeared to be a vulnerable enemy, eager to score a quick victory. His forces fell right into Morgan's trap. The American militia, feigning retreat, lured the British deeper into the battle. As the British pressed forward, they encountered the Continental Army's second line, which engaged them in fierce combat. The constant pressure and unexpected resistance from the Continental forces began to wear down Tarleton's men. The turning point came when the British, overstretched and disorganized, were caught in a devastating counterattack from the third line. Morgan's soldiers, fresh and highly disciplined, struck decisively, breaking the British lines and forcing a complete rout. Tarleton's forces were left with little option but to retreat, suffering heavy casualties. It was a humiliating defeat for the British, who had previously believed that their superior training and discipline would overwhelm the American forces in the South. The victory at Cowpens had far-reaching consequences. It reinvigorated the American cause in the South, lifting morale and providing much-needed momentum for the Continental Army. Morgan's victory also severely disrupted the British strategy, undermining their control over the South and forcing them into a defensive posture. The defeat of Tarleton's forces sent shockwaves through the British command and contributed to the eventual British surrender at Yorktown later that year. Cowpens was a clear demonstration of American resilience and tactical genius. Under Daniel Morgan's leadership, the Continental Army delivered a crushing blow to the British, shifting the momentum of the war in favor of the American cause. This victory proved to be a crucial turning point, one that would pave the way for ultimate independence. The Siege of Yorktown, fought between September 28 and October 19, 1781, stands as the final and decisive battle of the American Revolutionary War. This confrontation, marked by the combined efforts of American and French forces, would bring an end to British hopes of maintaining control over the American colonies. British General Lord Cornwallis, stationed at Yorktown, had been seeking to strengthen British forces in the south, but by the time he had entrenched himself in the Virginia port town, he found himself trapped by a coalition of forces he could not overcome. The British position at Yorktown seemed advantageous at first. Cornwallis, having achieved a series of victories in the southern colonies, believed that the town's strategic location on the Chesapeake Bay would offer ample opportunity for supplies to arrive by sea. However, the tides of war had shifted, and the French had joined the Americans in their fight for independence. The arrival of the French fleet, under Admiral de Grasse, sealed Cornwallis's fate, cutting off his expected reinforcements and supplies from the sea. On land, the American forces, commanded by General George Washington, and the French, led by General Jean-Baptiste Rochambeau, had been closing in on Cornwallis's position. The Continental Army, bolstered by the French, laid siege to the British fortifications around Yorktown, digging trenches and moving closer with every passing day. The British, already worn down by years of conflict, faced both exhaustion and limited resources, which severely weakened their ability to resist the siege. Washington, aware that this would be the final opportunity to secure American independence, displayed brilliant military strategy. With French naval forces controlling the waters, he was able to completely isolate Cornwallis's army, effectively rendering any escape impossible. The siege lasted for weeks, with both sides enduring harsh conditions. The French and American troops worked in unison, erecting fortifications, laying down fire, and bombarding the British positions, gradually forcing Cornwallis's forces into a corner. The decisive moment came when Cornwallis, realizing he had no way out, made the difficult decision to surrender. On October 19, 1781, he formally capitulated to Washington and Rochambeau, marking the end of active military operations in the American Revolution. The British general, despite his earlier successes, had been overwhelmed by a combination of strategic encirclement, naval dominance, and relentless siege tactics. The surrender at Yorktown was not only a military victory, but a symbolic triumph of the American cause. It demonstrated that the fledgling United States, with the help of its French allies, could defeat one of the most powerful empires in the world. While fighting would continue for a few more years in other parts of the globe, the Siege of Yorktown effectively ended British attempts to retain control over its American colonies. The victory marked the beginning of the end for the British in America and paved the way for the Treaty of Paris, which would formally recognize the United States as an independent nation. The surrender of General Lord Cornwallis at Yorktown on October 19, 1781, marked a momentous turning point in the American Revolutionary War. Though the British Army had not yet formally acknowledged defeat, the event was a clear and undeniable signal that the tide had turned irreversibly in favor of the American and French forces. Cornwallis, one of Britain's most seasoned generals, had been cornered after weeks of siege and bombardment by a combination of American and French troops, alongside a powerful French fleet that had blocked any hope of British reinforcements or escape. In the days leading up to the surrender, Cornwallis's situation had grown increasingly desperate. His forces were exhausted, food was running low, and the continued artillery barrage from Washington's army had left the British position at Yorktown untenable. He had hoped for a naval intervention from the British fleet, but the French had decisively gained control of the Chesapeake Bay, cutting off Cornwallis's lifeline. With no way to break the siege or gain relief, Cornwallis reluctantly agreed to surrender. The formal surrender, though a tactical retreat for the British, had profound significance. When Cornwallis, draped in the heavy weight of his failure, sent his second-in-command, General Charles O'Hara, to present his sword to Washington, it was a moment of remarkable symbolism. O'Hara, representing the defeated British army, attempted to offer the sword directly to Washington, but Washington, showing respect for the French allies who had contributed so heavily to the victory, directed O'Hara to General Rochambeau, the French commander. This small gesture of acknowledgement demonstrated the international nature of the struggle for independence, underscoring the importance of French support in securing victory. While Cornwallis's surrender was the symbolic end of the conflict, the reality was that the war was not yet officially over. Fighting continued in other parts of the world, and British forces still held some key positions. The war's formal conclusion would not come until the signing of the Treaty of Paris in 1783, but for many, the surrender at Yorktown was seen as the moment when the American Revolution was won. Cornwallis's capitulation shattered British resolve and sent ripples of disillusionment throughout the British government. It became evident that continuing the war was no longer feasible, and public opinion began to shift, pressuring the British to seek peace. The surrender itself, however, was not just a military victory. It was a triumph of resolve and determination for the American forces. General Washington, having led his troops through years of hardship, now stood at the helm of a movement that had changed the course of history. The success at Yorktown proved that the American cause, despite the odds, was not only possible but inevitable. The victory proved the strength of American resilience and the effectiveness of alliances forged with nations such as France. It was a victory for the American people and a testament to their unyielding desire for freedom. The Treaty of Paris, signed on September 3, 1783, marked the formal conclusion of the American Revolution and recognized the United States as an independent nation. This treaty, negotiated by American diplomats Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, and John Jay, ended nearly 8 years of war and hardship for the fledgling nation. It was a moment of great triumph for the Americans, but it also marked the end of Britain's dominance in the American colonies, a loss that would shape the future of both nations. The negotiations were complex, and while the United States and Britain both had their own interests at heart, the treaty was ultimately a compromise. The British, weary from years of conflict, sought peace, but their desire for a simple resolution was met with the American determination to secure more than just a cessation of hostilities. The Americans, aided by their French allies, pushed hard for favorable terms, including the recognition of their sovereignty and territorial expansion beyond the Appalachian Mountains. One of the key outcomes of the Treaty of Paris was Britain's official recognition of American independence. For the United States, this was not only a diplomatic victory, but also a symbolic one, as the world's most powerful empire finally acknowledged the right of a new republic to exist. The treaty also established boundaries for the new nation, extending from the Atlantic Ocean to the Mississippi River and from Canada to Florida, giving the United States vast new territories. In return for these concessions, the Americans agreed to recommend to the state legislatures that they return property taken from loyalists during the war and allow them to recover their rights as British subjects. This was a difficult pill to swallow for many in the United States, where the legacy of loyalty to Britain was deeply resented. However, the focus was on establishing peace and securing the independence of the nation, and thus the provision was reluctantly accepted. For Britain, the Treaty of Paris ended a costly war that had drained its resources. Though the treaty granted America independence, it was also a significant blow to British pride and imperial power. The loss of the colonies would eventually lead to the re-evaluation of British colonial policies, and over time, it would reshape the British Empire. The Treaty of Paris was not only a turning point for the United States, but also for the world. The recognition of American independence set a precedent for other nations, sparking movements for self-determination and revolution in other parts of the world. The treaty symbolized a triumph for the ideals of liberty and democracy, which the American Revolution had championed. In the years that followed, the Treaty of Paris became a reminder of the struggle and sacrifice that led to the birth of a new nation. It was a formal end to a long and arduous fight, but the treaty's true significance lay in what it represented: the beginning of a new era for the United States, free from British control, with a promise of self-governance and the opportunity to chart its own course on the world stage. The years following the American Revolution were marked by a series of challenges that tested the resilience of the newly formed United States. Though the country had won its independence from Britain, it now faced the daunting task of building a functioning government and addressing issues that threatened to destabilize the fragile Union. One of the most pressing challenges was the national debt. The war had left the country financially drained, and the new government had little in terms of revenue to cover the enormous costs of rebuilding. The Confederation Congress, the governing body at the time, struggled to pay off war debts, both domestic and foreign, and lacked the power to impose taxes. This left the country in a vulnerable position, relying on donations from the states, which were often insufficient. The inability to generate revenue effectively would soon become a major issue, with many states beginning to question the capacity of the Confederation government to manage national finances. Governance was another critical problem. The Articles of Confederation, adopted during the war, had served as a temporary solution, but proved inadequate for long-term governance. The Articles created a weak central government, giving most powers to the individual states. This decentralized system made it difficult for the government to act decisively on issues like trade, defense, and taxation. There was no executive branch to enforce laws, and Congress had little authority to regulate commerce between states or with foreign nations. This lack of central authority resulted in economic chaos, with states pursuing their own policies, which often led to trade disputes and tensions between them. The absence of a strong federal system became painfully apparent as the country grappled with issues like interstate tariffs and national defense. Perhaps the most profound challenge was the creation of a national identity. The United States was a collection of former colonies, each with its own distinct history, culture, and political concerns. While they had fought together against a common enemy, the war had not been a unifying force in the way many had hoped. The states remained largely independent, and there was no consensus on what the future of the nation should look like. The absence of a common cultural or political framework made it difficult to forge a unified vision for the country. Regionalism and sectionalism ran deep, and tensions between the North and South, the large states and the small states, and those who favored a strong central government versus those who supported states' rights, all contributed to the complexity of nation building. Despite these challenges, the country was not without hope. The victories of the Revolution had instilled a sense of pride and determination among the American people. The desire for a stronger, more unified government eventually led to the convening of the Constitutional Convention in 1787, where leaders like George Washington, James Madison, and Alexander Hamilton worked tirelessly to draft a new constitution. This document would eventually lay the foundation for the federal system of government that would allow the United States to survive and thrive in the face of internal and external pressures. Though the road ahead was long and fraught with difficulties, the challenges of the immediate post-revolutionary period were not insurmountable. The young nation would have to learn from its struggles, adapt, and ultimately create a government that could withstand the pressures of time, conflict, and change. The creation of a national identity, the establishment of a stable economy, and the building of a cohesive government would define the next chapters of America's story. Shays' Rebellion, which erupted in 1786, was a critical turning point in the early history of the United States. The uprising, led by former soldier Daniel Shays and a group of disgruntled farmers in Massachusetts, laid bare the profound weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation and exposed the inability of the central government to maintain order or address the economic struggles facing the new nation. The rebellion stemmed from the severe economic hardship faced by many farmers after the Revolutionary War. Despite their sacrifices during the conflict, many veterans, including Shays, returned home to find their land seized due to unpaid debts and taxes. As the states were burdened with war debts, local governments imposed heavy taxes to raise revenue, exacerbating the financial crisis. Farmers, particularly in rural areas, struggled to make ends meet and saw their properties and livelihoods threatened by the tax collectors. The growing discontent led to violent protests, with Shays and his followers attempting to seize the federal armory in Springfield, Massachusetts, in hopes of initiating a broader revolt. The central government, operating under the Articles of Confederation, was powerless to intervene. The Articles had intentionally created a weak central government, leaving the power to maintain law and order in the hands of the state. As a result, the federal government lacked the means to provide military support or coordinate a response. Massachusetts was forced to rely on its own militia to suppress the rebellion. The inability of the national government to provide any meaningful assistance during this crisis highlighted the inefficiencies of the Articles and underscored the need for a stronger, more centralized authority. Shays' Rebellion was not only a direct challenge to the Articles of Confederation, but also served as a wake-up call to the nation. The uprising revealed the fragility of the young country, where economic instability and civil unrest threatened the foundations of the republic. Leaders across the country began to realize that a stronger federal government, capable of managing the nation's finances, ensuring domestic tranquility, and providing for the common defense, was urgently needed. The rebellion fueled growing calls for reform, culminating in the Constitutional Convention of 1787, where a new system of government would be designed to address the failures of the Articles. While Shays' Rebellion was eventually put down, its impact reverberated throughout the country. It galvanized public opinion and pushed many to recognize that the Articles of Confederation were inadequate for governing a growing and diverse nation. In the aftermath, discussions about creating a new constitution gained momentum, with the establishment of a more powerful federal government becoming a central theme. The rebellion, in this sense, marked not just a moment of crisis, but also the beginning of the end for the Articles and the birth of the United States Constitution. The Constitutional Convention of 1787, held in Philadelphia, was a pivotal moment in the history of the United States. It was convened to address the weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation, which had proven inadequate for managing the growing challenges of the young nation. The delegates who gathered in Independence Hall were tasked with creating a new framework for government, one that could provide stability, maintain order, and strengthen the Union. The convention, originally called to amend the Articles, quickly turned into a complete overhaul of the system of governance. The framers of the Constitution, including key figures like George Washington, James Madison, Benjamin Franklin, and Alexander Hamilton, recognized that the Articles had failed to create a government strong enough to handle the nation's economic and political needs. The result was the drafting of a new constitution that would establish a stronger federal government with the power to regulate commerce, provide for the common defense, and enforce laws across the states. The debates that unfolded during the summer of 1787 were intense and often contentious. One of the central issues was the balance of power between the states and the federal government. Many delegates, particularly those from larger states, favored a system that would give the national government more authority, while smaller states feared that this would diminish their influence. This disagreement led to the creation of the Great Compromise, which established a bicameral legislature, with the Senate granting equal representation to all states and the House of Representatives based on population. This compromise helped ensure that both large and small states would have a voice in the new government. Another contentious issue was the question of slavery. Southern states, where the economy was heavily dependent on agriculture and slave labor, wanted slaves to be counted for purposes of representation in the House of Representatives, though they were unwilling to grant slaves basic rights. Northern states, where slavery was less prevalent, were opposed to such a provision. The result was the 3/5 compromise, which allowed each enslaved person to be counted as 3/5 of a person for representation purposes, though they would have no rights as citizens. This compromise highlighted the deep divisions in the nation over the issue of slavery. The delegates also debated the structure of the executive branch. Some favored a strong president with broad powers, while others feared the creation of a monarchy-like figure. After much debate, they decided on a single executive with limited powers, subject to checks and balances from the other branches of government. This would ensure that no one branch could dominate the others, and that power would remain distributed among the federal government, the states, and the people. The debates at the Constitutional Convention culminated in the signing of the U.S. Constitution on September 17, 1787. However, the work was far from done. The new Constitution still needed to be ratified by the states, and opposition from those who feared too much centralized power, known as the Anti-Federalists, would continue to shape the political landscape for years to come. Despite their concerns, the Constitution was ratified in 1788, and the new government was set to begin its work. The framers' vision of a more perfect union was now in motion, but the challenges of implementation and the struggle for a more inclusive and just nation were just beginning. The journey to add the Bill of Rights to the U.S. Constitution was as crucial as the drafting of the Constitution itself. As the new government began to take shape, it became clear that many Americans, particularly those who had opposed the Constitution during the ratification debates, felt uneasy about the lack of explicit protections for individual liberties. While the Constitution had outlined the powers and structure of the federal government, it did not clearly safeguard the rights of the people. This omission led to a heated debate, with many fearing that without such protections, the government might infringe upon fundamental freedoms. Just as the British had done before the Revolution, the movement to include a Bill of Rights was championed by figures like James Madison, who initially opposed the idea of a separate Bill of Rights, but eventually came to recognize its importance. He understood that the absence of such a document could jeopardize the stability of the new government, as it would likely be seen as an invitation for federal overreach. Madison's shift in perspective was also influenced by the strong public demand for such protections, especially in key states like New York and Virginia, where the Constitution had barely passed. In 1789, Madison introduced a series of amendments to the Constitution, inspired by the Virginia Declaration of Rights and the state constitutions that had already outlined certain freedoms. These amendments were designed to limit the powers of the federal government and protect personal freedoms like freedom of speech, religion, and the press. Madison's proposed list also sought to ensure fair trials and protection against cruel and unusual punishment. The proposed Bill of Rights went through a process of revision, with some provisions being rejected and others refined. After considerable debate and negotiation, Congress passed 12 amendments in 1789, and by December 1791, 10 of them were ratified by 3/4 of the states. These 10 amendments became known as the Bill of Rights. The Bill of Rights was more than just a set of legal principles. It was a reflection of the nation's commitment to the protection of individual freedoms and a vital safeguard against tyranny. It ensured that no government, federal or state, could trample on essential rights such as the right to speak freely, to assemble, to bear arms, and to practice one's religion without fear of government interference. The ratification of the Bill of Rights helped cement the legitimacy of the Constitution, ensuring that the new government would be one that recognized and respected the rights of its citizens. While the struggle for individual rights did not end with these 10 amendments, the Bill of Rights became the cornerstone of American democracy, offering an enduring framework for liberty and justice. It remains as a constant reminder that the government's power is limited and that the rights of the people are paramount. The Federalist Papers played a pivotal role in the ratification of the U.S. Constitution, and their influence cannot be overstated in the establishment of the new government. As the Constitution was being debated, the nation was deeply divided. Many feared the creation of a strong central government that might infringe upon individual freedoms and the autonomy of the states. These concerns were largely driven by the anti-federalists, who were hesitant to ratify a document they felt lacked sufficient protections for personal liberties. In response to this opposition, 3 of the most prominent figures in American politics, Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay, came together to write a series of essays advocating for the Constitution and addressing the fears of its critics. Hamilton, Madison, and Jay wrote under the collective pseudonym Publius, and their essays, later known as the Federalist Papers, sought to explain and defend the principles behind the Constitution. The Federalist Papers were not just arguments for ratification. They were a passionate defense of a balanced, strong federal system that could unify the states while also protecting individual freedoms. Hamilton, with his deep understanding of economic policy, wrote extensively about the need for a robust central government to regulate trade, handle foreign affairs, and manage national finances. Madison, a key architect of the Constitution, argued for a system of checks and balances that would prevent any one branch of government from becoming too powerful. John Jay, with his experience in diplomacy, focused on the importance of a unified nation to strengthen its position on the world stage. Together, their essays addressed nearly every objection raised by the anti-federalists, from the potential for tyranny to the fear that the new government would trample the rights of the states. Through their arguments, Hamilton, Madison, and Jay reassured Americans that the Constitution was designed to preserve liberty, not threaten it. The separation of powers and the system of checks and balances, they argued, would protect against the very tyranny the Constitution was meant to prevent. The Federalist Papers played a crucial role in swaying public opinion, especially in key states like New York and Virginia. While the Constitution was not universally popular, the clear and persuasive arguments presented by Hamilton, Madison, and Jay helped tip the balance in favor of ratification. By June 1788, enough states had ratified the Constitution for it to become law, and the new federal government was ready to take shape. In the aftermath of ratification, the creation of the United States government began in earnest. The first Congress convened in 1789, and George Washington was unanimously elected as the first president. The Constitution, once a contentious document, had become the framework for a government that would eventually lead to the formation of one of the world's most influential nations. The ratification process and the Federalist Papers marked a turning point in American history, ushering in a new era of government based on the principles of democracy, liberty, and the rule of law. George Washington's presidency marked the beginning of a new era in American history, one that would shape the nation for centuries to come. As the first president, Washington's leadership was both crucial and unprecedented. The country had just emerged from the Revolutionary War, and the foundations of the new government were fragile at best. Washington, a revered military leader who had commanded the Continental Army to victory, was selected unanimously by the Electoral College to become the first president. His leadership was essential in uniting a nation still divided by regional interests, ideological differences, and lingering suspicions of centralized power. Washington's presidency was not merely about governing, it was about setting precedents for future leaders and establishing the norms that would define the executive branch. In many ways, Washington had to figure out how to execute the office while remaining faithful to the Constitution, and his decisions in those early years would guide the nation's development. One of his most significant contributions was the establishment of the Cabinet, a group of advisors who would help him navigate the complexities of governing a new nation. Washington appointed figures like Thomas Jefferson as Secretary of State, Alexander Hamilton as Secretary of the Treasury, and Henry Knox as Secretary of War, each of whom would play pivotal roles in shaping the nation's policies. In his role as president, Washington understood the importance of balancing power between the federal government and the states. He worked closely with Congress to lay the groundwork for a strong central government, all while trying to ensure that it did not overreach its authority. He was adamant about avoiding the tyranny of monarchical rule and wanted to create a presidency that would be accountable to the people. His decision to step down after 2 terms in office was one of the most important precedents he set, demonstrating that the office should not be a lifetime appointment, but rather one that would serve the interests of the nation. Washington's leadership extended beyond the formation of government institutions. He was faced with foreign and domestic challenges, and his responses to them laid the groundwork for the nation's future. His foreign policy, particularly his neutrality in European conflicts, established a precedent that would guide American foreign relations for years to come. At home, Washington faced challenges like the Whiskey Rebellion, where his strong response demonstrated the federal government's ability to enforce law and order. Though Washington's presidency was not without its challenges, his leadership helped to solidify the United States as a stable, functioning democracy. By the time he left office, he had established norms and practices that would endure for generations. His presidency was the birth of a nation that was still finding its footing, and yet, Washington's steady hand provided the foundation upon which the United States would continue to grow and develop. His leadership set the stage for future presidents to follow, and his legacy as the first president remains an enduring symbol of national unity and strength. In the early years of the American Republic, the idea of political parties seemed inconceivable to many of the nation's founders. The very notion of factions was viewed with suspicion, as it contradicted the ideals of unity that had brought the country together. Yet, despite this, political parties began to take shape as disagreements over the direction of the new nation emerged. The philosophical divide between Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson set the stage for the formation of the first political parties, the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans. Hamilton, as the first Secretary of the Treasury, had a vision for the United States that emphasized a strong central government, a robust financial system, and close ties with Britain. He believed that a powerful federal government was essential to securing the nation's future and ensuring its economic stability. To accomplish this, Hamilton proposed the creation of a national bank, the assumption of state debts by the federal government, and the establishment of protective tariffs. His vision was rooted in the belief that the government should have the authority to regulate and support commerce, industry, and infrastructure, and that a strong centralized state would safeguard the nation from external threats and internal disarray. In contrast, Jefferson, who served as Secretary of State, had a fundamentally different vision for the future of the United States. He was a staunch advocate for states' rights and feared that a powerful central government would lead to tyranny. Jefferson's ideal America was one where the federal government had limited powers and the states retained much of their sovereignty. He championed an agrarian society, believing that farmers were the backbone of the nation and that the government should support rural, decentralized economies. Jefferson also opposed Hamilton's plan for a national bank, arguing that it was unconstitutional and that it would benefit the wealthy elite at the expense of the common people. These starkly opposing views on government and economy led to the formation of 2 distinct political factions. The Federalists, led by Hamilton, advocated for a strong national government, a centralized financial system, and closer ties with Britain. They were supported by wealthy merchants, bankers, and industrialists who believed in the benefits of a strong, centralized economic system. On the other side, the Democratic Republicans, led by Jefferson, argued for a limited federal government, states' rights, and an economy based on agriculture. They were supported by farmers, Southern planters, and those who feared the concentration of power in the hands of a few elites. As the 1790s progressed, the rift between these two factions deepened, with political parties taking form and dividing the nation. These early political struggles not only shaped the direction of the American Republic, but also set a precedent for the role of political parties in American democracy. Despite their differences, both Hamilton and Jefferson played pivotal roles in shaping the nation's political system, and their visions for the future continue to influence the debates in American politics today. The Whiskey Rebellion of 1794 marked the first significant test of federal authority under the newly ratified United States Constitution. It arose in response to an excise tax imposed on distilled spirits, a part of Alexander Hamilton's broader economic plan to raise revenue and stabilize the fledgling nation's finances. Hamilton believed that the tax was necessary to pay off the national debt and establish the credit of the United States, but it was deeply unpopular, especially among frontier farmers. In the western regions of Pennsylvania, where whiskey was a major part of the local economy, the tax was seen as an unfair burden on small-scale farmers. Many of these farmers turned their surplus grain into whiskey, which was easier to transport and more profitable than raw grain. The tax was viewed not only as a financial hardship, but also as an infringement on the rights of rural Americans, who felt that their concerns were being ignored by the federal government in distant Philadelphia. Tensions quickly escalated, and by 1794, a group of farmers began openly resisting the tax, using violence to intimidate tax collectors and burn buildings associated with the enforcement of the law. In response to the growing unrest, President George Washington and his administration took swift action. Washington was determined to establish the federal government's ability to enforce its laws and demonstrate that violent resistance to the law would not be tolerated. The federal government sent a large military force, led by Washington himself, to Pennsylvania to suppress the rebellion. The show of force was enough to quell the violence without significant bloodshed, as the insurgents scattered and the rebellion quickly faded. Only a few individuals were arrested, and ultimately, no major battles occurred. Washington's response to the Whiskey Rebellion was pivotal in establishing the principle of federal supremacy. The swift and decisive action sent a clear message that the new government, under the Constitution, had both the right and the power to enforce federal laws, even in the face of widespread discontent. The rebellion also helped to solidify the role of the executive branch in maintaining order and implementing national policy, showing that the president had the authority to act in times of crisis. Though the Whiskey Rebellion was a short-lived uprising, it was a formative moment for the young nation, revealing the fragile balance between federal authority and individual liberty. While some viewed Washington's actions as a necessary assertion of government power, others saw it as an overreach, signaling the potential for a strong central government to infringe upon the freedoms of ordinary citizens. Nevertheless, the rebellion set an important precedent for future challenges to federal authority and the ongoing struggle between states' rights and the power of the national government. In the wake of the Revolutionary War, one of the most pressing concerns for the new United States was maintaining peace with Britain. Though the Treaty of Paris had officially ended the war in 1783, tensions between the two nations remained high, especially over issues such as British interference with American shipping and the presence of British troops in frontier forts. Washington, aware of the fragile state of the young nation, sought to avoid another war with Britain and preserve the fragile peace that had been achieved. In 1794, To address these issues, Washington sent John Jay, the Chief Justice of the United States, to London to negotiate a treaty. The resulting Jay Treaty was designed to resolve lingering disputes between the two nations, particularly concerning trade and the continued British occupation of certain forts in the Northwest Territory. It also aimed to prevent further British interference with American commerce, which had been a significant source of tension since the end of the war. The treaty called for the withdrawal of British troops from American territory, the establishment of a commission to resolve border disputes, and the protection of American trade with the British Caribbean. While the treaty was a diplomatic victory for Washington, its reception back home was far from positive. Many Americans, particularly those aligned with Thomas Jefferson and the Democratic-Republican Party, viewed the treaty as a betrayal of American interests. They argued that it favored British interests over those of the United States, especially given that it did not address the issue of British impressment of American sailors, which had been a major grievance. The treaty also seemed to align the United States too closely with Britain at a time when France, a key American ally during the Revolution, was engaged in its own revolutionary struggle against Britain. Critics argued that Washington's administration was too eager to appease Britain, which seemed to be disregarding the rights of American citizens. The debate over the Jay Treaty became highly polarized, with Federalists, led by Washington and Hamilton, supporting it as a necessary step towards securing American peace and stability, while Jeffersonian Republicans denounced it as an affront to American sovereignty. Despite the controversy, the treaty was ratified by the Senate in 1795, though by a narrow margin. The treaty's ratification was seen by many as a triumph of diplomacy and a testament to Washington's leadership. However, the fallout from the treaty had lasting consequences for American foreign policy and politics. In the aftermath of the Jay Treaty, foreign relations became even more contentious. While it did succeed in averting war with Britain and securing certain American interests, it also deepened divisions within the United States, particularly between the emerging political parties. The treaty highlighted the complexities of navigating international diplomacy while balancing competing domestic interests, and it set the stage for future American foreign policy debates that would continue to shape the nation's development in the years to come. As the young nation of the United States began to settle into its new government under the Frenda Constitution, the seeds of political division were already beginning to take root. What had been intended as a unified effort to ensure the survival of the Republic soon gave way to the emergence of distinct political factions, each advocating for different visions of America's future. These factions did not form overnight, but rather were shaped by a combination of ideological differences, economic interests, and foreign policy considerations, which slowly crystallized into two distinct political ideologies. The Federalist faction, led by figures like Alexander Hamilton, John Adams, and John Jay, advocated for a strong central government. They believed that a powerful national government was essential for maintaining order, ensuring the nation's security, and facilitating economic growth. Federalists supported policies that favored industry, a national bank, and a robust financial system, which would stabilize the new nation's economy. They were also proponents of closer ties with Britain, seeing Britain's economic and military power as a stabilizing influence. The Federalists were inclined to support the wealthy merchant class and urban elites, whose interests were more aligned with centralization and federal authority. In contrast, the Democratic Republicans, led by Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, were deeply skeptical of a strong central government. They believed in the virtues of a limited federal government, with most of the power remaining with the states and the people. The Democratic Republicans argued that too much federal power would lead to tyranny, much like the oppressive rule they had fought to free themselves from during the Revolution. They championed the rights of farmers, small landowners, and agrarian interests, seeing them as the backbone of the nation. Jefferson and Madison also advocated for stronger ties with France, particularly as the French Revolution gained momentum, viewing France as a fellow republic that shared the values of liberty and democracy. These differing visions of America's future led to the formation of the first political parties in the nation's history. The Federalists and the Democratic Republicans found themselves in increasingly sharp opposition, with the Federalists pushing for policies that would strengthen the central government and the nation's financial infrastructure, while the Democratic Republicans sought to limit government power and promote the interests of the common people. As each faction grew in strength, so too did their political and ideological divides, shaping the trajectory of early American politics. The emergence of these two factions marked the beginning of partisan politics in the United States, a system that would continue to evolve and define the country's political landscape. The rivalry between the Federalists and Democratic Republicans would shape the policies of the early republic, with debates over issues like the national bank, foreign policy, and the role of government in the economy taking center stage. As the country matured, these factions would evolve into political parties, solidifying the role of competition and debate in American democracy. While the Federalists and Democratic Republicans disagreed fiercely, they both contributed to the broader development of the American political system, laying the foundation for the party politics that would dominate the nation for centuries to come. As the United States entered the 1790s, tensions with foreign powers began to simmer, particularly with France. John Adams, having assumed the presidency in 1797, inherited a precarious situation. The relationship between the two nations, once allies during the American Revolution, had soured due to the turmoil caused by the French Revolution and its aftermath. France, engaged in its own revolutionary wars, was deeply distrustful of American neutrality, especially as the US maintained trade relations with Britain, France's bitter enemy. Meanwhile, the United States, still in its infancy, struggled to assert itself in international diplomacy. In 1798, the French government, led by the Directory, began seizing American merchant ships as retaliation for perceived American favoritism toward Britain. This resulted in an undeclared conflict known as the Quasi-War. While no official declaration of war was made, American and French naval forces clashed in the Caribbean and along the American coastline. The Quasi-War was marked by a series of naval engagements, and although it was a largely undeclared and limited conflict, it tested the young nation's ability to defend its interests abroad. Adams, unwilling to escalate the situation into a full-scale war, pursued diplomatic efforts to negotiate a resolution, but also took steps to strengthen the U.S. military. At home, the crisis with France led to the passage of the Alien and Sedition Acts, a series of laws designed to suppress dissent and maintain national security during the turbulent times. The Alien Act allowed the president to deport foreign nationals deemed dangerous to the peace and safety of the country, while the Sedition Act made it a crime to publish or speak out against the government. These acts were controversial, particularly among the Democratic Republicans, who saw them as a violation of the First Amendment and an overreach of federal power. The Alien and Sedition Acts were seen by many as tools used by the Federalists to suppress political opposition, especially as the Democratic Republicans were gaining momentum in opposition to Adams and his party. The Quasi-War and the subsequent passage of these laws were pivotal moments in Adams' presidency, while Adams was able to navigate the U.S. through the crisis without succumbing to full-scale war. The tension with France and the political fallout from the Alien and Sedition Acts created a divisive atmosphere at home. The Democratic Republicans, led by Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, vehemently opposed the acts, arguing that they were an infringement on individual freedoms and political opposition. Adams, caught between national security concerns and the defense of civil liberties, found his presidency increasingly unpopular, and his actions during this time became a flashpoint in the broader ideological battles between the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans. though the Quasi-War eventually came to an end with the signing of the Convention of 1800, the effects of the conflict and the Alien and Sedition Acts lingered. The Federalist Party's harsh measures alienated many Americans, and the popularity of the Democratic Republicans, who championed individual freedoms, grew significantly. Adams, despite his diplomatic success in averting full-scale war, found himself politically weakened, and the Quasi-War ultimately contributed to the Federalists' decline. The early years of the Republic, shaped by foreign conflicts and internal divisions, would continue to test the resilience of the American political system. The election of 1800 was one of the most contentious in American history, marking a turning point in the nation's political development. The country was deeply divided, with the Federalist Party, led by outgoing President John Adams, facing off against the Democratic Republican Party, headed by Thomas Jefferson. The battle for control of the presidency became a fierce ideological clash, centered around differing views of the role of government, individual liberties, and the future direction of the nation. The election itself was marked by intense partisanship, fueled by the political polarization that had been growing since the beginning of the decade. The Federalists, led by Adams and his vice president, Charles C. Pinckney, championed a strong central government and closer ties with Britain, whereas the Democratic Republicans, led by Jefferson and his running mate, Aaron Burr, advocated for states' rights, a limited federal government, and support for the French Revolution. Both sides were entrenched in their positions, and the rhetoric of the campaign grew increasingly hostile. The election was complicated further by the structure of the Electoral College. Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr, both members of the same party, received an equal number of electoral votes, which threw the decision into the hands of the House of Representatives. The deadlock between the two men lasted for several days, with many Federalists in the House unwilling to support either Jefferson or Burr. Eventually, after 36 ballots, Jefferson was elected president, and Burr was named vice president. The outcome was a victory for the Democratic Republicans, but the process highlighted the flaws in the electoral system and the bitter partisan divide. Despite the contentious nature of the election, the transition of power from the Federalists to the Democratic Republicans was remarkably peaceful, setting an important precedent for future elections. Jefferson's victory was seen as a triumph for the people's will, and he sought to assure the nation that, while the election had been hard fought, the principles of democracy and the peaceful transfer of power were intact. In his inaugural address, Jefferson famously declared, "We are all Republicans, we are all Federalists," emphasizing the need for unity in the aftermath of a deeply divisive election. The election of 1800 marked the rise of Thomas Jefferson as one of the nation's most influential political figures. His vision of a more egalitarian government, rooted in agrarian values and local control, resonated with many Americans, particularly those in the South and West. Jefferson's victory also signaled the decline of the Federalist Party, which struggled to maintain relevance in the face of growing opposition. The peaceful transfer of power demonstrated the strength and resilience of the American political system, proving that even in times of political turmoil, the democratic process could prevail. Jefferson's election would pave the way for the growth of the Republican Party and shape the future of the young republic. The Louisiana Purchase of 1803 was one of the most significant events in American history, fundamentally altering the nation's future trajectory. The acquisition of a vast expanse of land from France doubled the size of the United States and opened up vast new territories for exploration and settlement. The deal, orchestrated by President Thomas Jefferson, was a bold move that reflected both his vision for the country's future and the complexities of his presidency. Jefferson, who had long been a proponent of an agrarian republic and limited government, was faced with the opportunity to expand the nation's borders in a way that would secure its future as a democratic and self-sustaining country. The acquisition of the Louisiana Territory, which stretched from the Mississippi River to the Rocky Mountains and from the Gulf of Mexico to Canada, promised to provide vast resources, fertile land, and access to critical trade routes. It was a visionary move that could ensure the nation's agricultural economy would thrive for generations to come. However, the Louisiana Purchase was not without its challenges and contradictions. Jefferson, a strict constructionist who believed in adhering to the limits of the Constitution, was faced with the question of whether the acquisition of such a large territory was within the president's constitutional powers. Despite his reservations about broad federal authority, Jefferson ultimately decided that the benefits of the purchase outweighed the constitutional concerns. His decision was largely based on the notion that a strong, growing nation would be essential for the preservation of liberty and self-government. While some of his political allies questioned the constitutionality of the deal, Jefferson's pragmatic approach ultimately prevailed. The acquisition of the Louisiana Territory had profound implications for the development of the United States. It provided the country with an enormous land base, setting the stage for westward expansion and the eventual settlement of new states. The purchase also secured control of the Mississippi River and the port of New Orleans, which were vital to American trade and commerce. The new territory gave American farmers access to important trade routes, ensuring that the nation's agricultural economy would continue to thrive. Moreover, the Louisiana Purchase laid the groundwork for the concept of manifest destiny, the belief that the United States was destined to expand across the North American continent. It opened up the possibility of a vast new nation stretching from coast to coast, fostering a sense of national unity and purpose. The acquisition sparked waves of migration and settlement, and in the decades that followed, it would lead to the creation of new states and the exploration of the American West by figures like Lewis and Clark. In the short term, the Louisiana Purchase was a major political triumph for Jefferson, who saw it as a fulfillment of the nation's potential. In the long term, it reshaped the American landscape, both physically and politically, and set the stage for the United States to become a continental power. Jefferson's bold decision to pursue the acquisition of the Louisiana Territory would prove to be one of the most important acts of his presidency, profoundly altering the course of American history. The Lewis and Clark expedition, which began in 1804, was one of the most significant undertakings in the history of the United States. Tasked by President Thomas Jefferson to explore the newly acquired Louisiana Territory, Meriwether Lewis and William Clark were charged with mapping the vast, unexplored land and establishing American presence across the western frontier. Their journey would not only deepen the understanding of the American continent, but also help set the stage for westward expansion, and it provided crucial insights into the diverse ecosystems, Native American cultures, and resources that lay beyond the Mississippi River. The expedition began in May 1804, when Lewis and Clark, along with their corps of discovery, departed from St. Louis. They followed the Missouri River upstream, charting unknown territory and documenting the geography, flora, and fauna of the land. The journey was treacherous from the start. The group faced formidable challenges: unpredictable weather, dangerous rivers, rough terrain, and encounters with hostile tribes. Despite these obstacles, the expedition members displayed remarkable resilience and resourcefulness, relying on their skills in navigation, diplomacy, and survival. Along the way, Lewis and Clark discovered numerous rivers, mountain ranges, and plains, laying the groundwork for future settlement and trade. They encountered many Native American tribes, some of whom were initially wary but ultimately provided invaluable assistance. One of the most notable figures in the expedition's success was Sacagawea, a Shoshone woman who served as an interpreter and guide. Her knowledge of the land and languages proved indispensable, and her presence helped establish peaceful relations with various tribes. The explorers also encountered diverse wildlife, including bison, bears, and a variety of bird species, and collected detailed records of these findings, which would later be of immense scientific value. Their documentation of the resources available in the Western Territories was critical for Jefferson's vision of expanding the nation's agricultural base. The expedition revealed the immense potential of the land, including fertile soil, timber, and natural resources that could support future development. Despite the many successes, the expedition was far from easy. The explorers battled harsh winter conditions, navigated difficult mountain passes, and faced food shortages. They had to adapt to the challenges posed by an unforgiving environment, and at times, their perseverance was tested to its limits. However, their determination paid off when, in November 1805, they reached the Pacific Ocean, completing the journey and marking the first successful overland expedition to the western shores of the continent. The Lewis and Clark expedition had profound consequences for the United States. It provided detailed maps and reports that would guide future settlers and explorers into the Western Territories. It also strengthened the nation's claim to the vast expanse of land that had been acquired through the Louisiana Purchase. The expedition inspired further exploration and laid the foundation for the expansionist vision that would define the 19th century. Though they faced immense challenges, Lewis and Clark's journey ultimately helped shape the future of the United States as a continental power. The War of 1812, often overshadowed by other conflicts in American history, marked a crucial moment in the young nation's struggle for independence and identity. It was a conflict between the United States and Great Britain, which had been simmering for years due to a mix of unresolved issues stemming from the American Revolution, British interference with American trade, and the ongoing tension over American territorial expansion. The immediate causes of the war were the British practice of impressment, where American sailors were forcibly recruited into the British Navy, and their interference with American shipping. Additionally, British support for Native American tribes resisting American expansion on the western frontier further fueled the animosity. The war began in 1812, when President James Madison asked Congress for a declaration of war. The conflict was deeply unpopular in some regions, particularly in New England, where trade relations with Britain were vital, but it gained strong support in the South and West, where expansionist fervor was high. The United States hoped to force Britain to respect its sovereignty and gain control over disputed territories, particularly in Canada, but the war did not go as planned. Early American efforts were hampered by inadequate preparation and a lack of military resources. The U.S. attempted to invade Canada, but faced stiff resistance and logistical challenges. Key battles in the first years of the war, such as the failed invasions of Canada and the British blockade of American ports, exposed the weaknesses of the young nation's military infrastructure. However, there were also some successes. American forces managed to score notable victories on the Great Lakes and in naval battles, where the United States Navy, though small, won several crucial engagements. One of the most iconic moments of the war came in 1814, when British forces attacked Washington, D.C., burning much of the city, including the White House and the Capitol. This humiliation galvanized American resolve, and the subsequent Battle of Baltimore, famously immortalized in The Star-Spangled Banner, saw American forces repelling British troops, boosting national morale. Meanwhile, on the western frontier, U.S. forces engaged in battles with Native American tribes, who had been bolstered by British support, further asserting American claims to land and security in the region. The war was essentially a stalemate, with neither side able to decisively defeat the other. However, the Treaty of Ghent, signed in December 1814, ended the war, restoring pre-war boundaries and resolving none of the underlying issues. Despite this, the war had a significant impact on the United States. It fostered a sense of national unity and identity, especially after the British failed to impose their will. The conflict also led to the demise of the Federalist Party, which had opposed the war and paved the way for the so-called Era of Good Feelings, a period of relative political harmony. The War of 1812, while not a clear-cut victory for either side, reinforced the United States' resolve to maintain its sovereignty and prove to both Americans and the world that the nation could stand its ground against one of the most powerful empires of the time. It played a key role in shaping the future trajectory of the United States, particularly in its push for territorial expansion and the emergence of a distinct American identity separate from British influence. The period following the War of 1812, often referred to as the Era of Good Feelings, was characterized by a sense of political unity and national pride. The war, despite its inconclusive results, had helped solidify the United States' independence and demonstrated its resilience. The defeat of British forces, coupled with the collapse of the Federalist Party, left the Democratic-Republican Party as the dominant political force, and for a brief period, there was little partisan opposition. President James Monroe, who took office in 1817, capitalized on this sense of unity to push forward with his vision for the future of the nation. Monroe's presidency marked a time of relative tranquility and economic growth, though it was not without its challenges. The country was still struggling with internal divisions, especially over issues such as slavery and the expansion of territory. Nevertheless, the Era of Good Feelings saw the growth of American industry, a booming economy, and a strengthened sense of American identity. The political climate was one of national cooperation, as the United States seemed to have emerged from the War of 1812, stronger and more united than ever before. However, it was not just internal unity that defined the period. The United States also began to assert itself on the global stage. One of Monroe's most significant contributions during this time was the Monroe Doctrine, issued in 1823. The doctrine was a bold statement of American foreign policy that declared the Western Hemisphere off-limits to European colonization and interference. At its core, the Monroe Doctrine aimed to protect the newly independent nations of Latin America from European imperial ambitions, as many of them had recently gained their independence from Spain. It also served to solidify the United States' position as the dominant power in the Western Hemisphere. The Monroe Doctrine was not a military threat, but rather a diplomatic assertion of American influence. It sent a clear message that the United States would not tolerate European attempts to reclaim colonies or interfere in the affairs of the Americas. This was particularly important as European powers, such as Spain and France, still held remnants of their empires in the Americas. The doctrine also marked a shift in American foreign policy, as the country began to move away from its previous stance of non-intervention and focused more on asserting its own interests. While the Monroe Doctrine was not immediately tested, it would go on to become a cornerstone of U.S. foreign policy in the years to come. It reinforced the idea that the United States was a growing power, capable of influencing events far beyond its borders. The Monroe Doctrine marked a turning point in American diplomacy, setting the stage for future interventions in Latin America and asserting American authority in the Western Hemisphere for generations to come. Despite its challenges, the Era of Good Feelings laid the foundation for the United States' emergence as a global power in the 19th century. In the early 19th century, American nationalism began to flourish, fueled by a growing sense of pride and unity that emerged from the successes of the War of 1812 and the relative stability that followed. This period marked a shift from the fractured, post-revolutionary struggles of the previous decades to a more cohesive national identity. As the country expanded westward and underwent significant economic, social, and political changes, the people began to increasingly see themselves as citizens of a united nation, rather than just individual states. The significance of national symbols played a crucial role in the development of this new American identity. Icons like the American flag, the bald eagle, and the national anthem became potent symbols of the nation's values and aspirations. The flag, with its stars representing the expanding states and the stripes symbolizing unity, served as a visual reminder of the country's growth and the ideals it stood for. The bald eagle, majestic and free, embodied the spirit of the American people and their hopes for independence and strength. Meanwhile, the national anthem, particularly after being adopted during this period, became a rallying cry for national pride and solidarity. As the United States expanded its territory through the Louisiana Purchase, the acquisition of Florida, and the settlement of the West, the nation's identity was further shaped by the idea of manifest destiny, the belief that it was America's destiny to expand from coast to coast. This expansionist spirit was driven by a sense of national purpose and the belief that American values and democracy should spread across the continent. The frontier became a symbol of opportunity and the promise of a better life, drawing settlers and immigrants from all over the world. Nationalism also found expression in the cultural and intellectual life of the country. Writers, artists, and musicians began to look to American history, landscapes, and experiences for inspiration. The work of authors like Washington Irving and James Fenimore Cooper helped to shape a distinctly American literary tradition, one that celebrated the country's unique character and history. American artists began to paint landscapes that captured the vastness and beauty of the new nation, while composers created music that reflected the American spirit. The growth of American nationalism was also influenced by the development of a more unified economy. The Industrial Revolution and the rise of infrastructure, such as canals and railroads, connected the far-flung regions of the United States, making it easier for goods, people, and ideas to move across the country. The idea of a national economy took hold as industries in the north, agriculture in the south, and settlers moving west all became part of a broader economic system. Through these developments, the United States began to feel more like a cohesive, unified nation. While regional differences still existed, the symbols of nationalism, the expansion of the country, and the growth of a shared economic and cultural identity played a significant role in forging a sense of pride in being American. As the 19th century unfolded, the seeds of nationalism planted during this period would shape the country's future, setting the stage for its eventual emergence as a global power. The early 19th century in America witnessed profound economic and technological changes that transformed the nation's landscape. These changes were driven by the forces of industrialization, which began to reshape the economy and labor markets in ways that had never been seen before. As the country moved into the Industrial Revolution, innovations in technology, transportation, and communication began to revolutionize the way goods were produced and distributed, leading to an economic transformation that would lay the foundation for America's future prosperity. One of the most significant technological advancements was the rise of mechanized industry. The invention of the cotton gin by Eli Whitney in 1793 revolutionized the cotton industry, making it possible to process cotton more efficiently and sparking a boom in cotton production in the South. This increase in production also fueled the demand for slave labor, which remained a deeply divisive issue in American society. Meanwhile, in the North, the growth of factories and the development of mass production methods began to drive industrial growth. The creation of textile mills, steam engines, and other machinery led to an explosion in manufacturing that transformed urban areas into bustling centers of economic activity. Transportation advancements also played a critical role in the economic transformation. The development of the steam engine, pioneered by figures like Robert Fulton, made steamboats a common sight on rivers, greatly improving the transportation of goods and people. This innovation was soon followed by the rise of railroads, which connected previously isolated regions of the country. The expansion of the railroad system created a more integrated national economy, facilitating the flow of goods across vast distances and opening new markets for American products. As a result, the United States became increasingly interconnected, with the goods produced in factories in the north reaching southern plantations and western farms, and vice versa. The effects of industrialization on labor were equally profound. With the growth of factories came a shift from traditional agricultural work to factory-based wage labor. This transformation meant that many Americans, particularly in urban areas, began to work in factories under often harsh and unsafe conditions. The shift to industrial labor also meant that women and children entered the workforce in large numbers, often at lower wages than men. As a result, new social and economic divisions emerged, with factory owners and industrialists reaping significant profits, while many workers struggled with long hours, poor working conditions, and low pay. Industrialization also led to the growth of cities as people flocked to urban centers in search of work. The rise of cities brought both opportunities and challenges. While these urban areas became economic powerhouses, they also became overcrowded and unsanitary, with the rapid influx of people leading to housing shortages, poor living conditions, and public health crises. Despite the social challenges, industrialization spurred economic growth that propelled the United States into a new era of global economic prominence. The rise of factories, railroads, and mass production laid the groundwork for the country's economic power and influenced its role on the world stage. While the effects of industrialization were far from uniform and posed challenges to the workforce, the changes brought about by this economic transformation shaped the future of American society in ways that would continue to unfold throughout the 19th century and beyond. The expansion of slavery in the southern states was a defining issue in the years leading up to the Civil War, shaping both the economy and the moral landscape of the United States. As the country expanded westward, the question of whether new territories and states would permit slavery became increasingly contentious. The southern states, where agriculture, particularly cotton, tobacco, and rice, thrived, relied heavily on slave labor. With the invention of the cotton gin in the late 18th century, the demand for enslaved labor skyrocketed, intensifying the institution's grip on the southern economy and way of life. Meanwhile, the northern states, which were becoming more industrialized, began to view slavery with growing moral opposition, setting the stage for a bitter national divide. The Missouri Compromise of 1820, which admitted Missouri as a slave state and Maine as a free state, was one of the first significant attempts to address the issue of slavery's expansion. However, the compromise only temporarily quelled tensions, as the question of slavery's place in the Western territories continued to loom large. In the 1840s and 1850s, as the United States acquired new territories through the annexation of Texas, the Oregon Territory, and the Mexican-American War, the issue of whether these new regions would allow slavery became a critical point of contention. The Compromise of 1850, which included the controversial Fugitive Slave Act, attempted to balance the interests of both free and slave states, but instead deepened the divide between the two. The moral and political tensions surrounding slavery reached a boiling point with the publication of Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin in 1852. The novel's portrayal of the brutal realities of slavery brought the issue to the forefront of American consciousness, further fueling abolitionist sentiment in the North. Meanwhile, the South continued to defend slavery as essential to its economic stability and way of life. The debate over the morality of slavery was no longer a regional issue, but a national one, with the country increasingly polarized between pro-slavery and anti-slavery factions. The Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854, which allowed the residents of Kansas and Nebraska to decide for themselves whether to allow slavery through popular sovereignty, further exacerbated the tensions. The violent confrontations between pro-slavery and anti-slavery settlers in Kansas, known as Bleeding Kansas, served as a grim preview of the violence that would soon engulf the nation. The Supreme Court's Dred Scott decision of 1857, which ruled that African Americans were not citizens and had no rights to sue in federal court, further embittered the divide between North and South. By the late 1850s, the political landscape had shifted dramatically. The rise of the Republican Party, which opposed the expansion of slavery into the Western territories, signaled a new phase in the conflict. In 1860, the election of Abraham Lincoln, who was committed to halting the spread of slavery, led to the secession of Southern states from the Union. The South, fearing the loss of political power and the eventual abolition of slavery, viewed Lincoln's election as a direct threat to their way of life. The stage was set for the Civil War, a brutal conflict that would ultimately determine the fate of slavery in the United States. The expansion of slavery in the Southern states, combined with the growing moral, political, and economic tensions, had pushed the nation to the brink. The road to the Civil War was paved with compromises, conflicts, and failures to address the deep-rooted divisions within the country. The war itself would be fought to resolve the fundamental question of whether slavery would continue to expand or be eradicated altogether. The American Revolution was a pivotal moment in the history of not only the United States, the world. Its effects rippled through American society, government, and beyond, shaping the course of modern history. The revolution was not just a fight for independence from Britain. It was a struggle for the ideals of freedom, equality, and liberty. These principles, though imperfectly applied at the time, became the foundation upon which the United States was built. The revolution's impact extended far beyond the military victories and the political upheaval, leaving a legacy that would influence nations around the world. In the immediate aftermath of the revolution, the newly formed United States faced immense challenges. The Articles of Confederation, which served as the first constitution, revealed significant flaws in governance, leading to the drafting of the U.S. Constitution. The revolution had established the idea that government's legitimacy rested on the consent of the governed, a radical departure from monarchies and empires. The creation of a government designed by the people for the people marked a significant departure from centuries of autocratic rule. The Constitution established a framework for balancing power between federal and state governments and between the three branches of government, ensuring that no single entity could gain too much control. The ideals of the revolution continued to resonate as the country grew. The commitment to individual rights, as seen in the Bill of Rights, reflected the revolution's emphasis on protecting personal freedoms. These documents enshrined the rights to free speech, religion, and a fair trial principles that would come to define American democracy. However, it would take many years and countless struggles to fully realize these ideals for all Americans. Slavery remained entrenched in the South, and the rights of women and Native Americans were largely ignored. It was through the relentless efforts of activists and reformers that the American promise of liberty would slowly begin to expand to more and more citizens. On the global stage, the American Revolution sparked a wave of revolutionary movements in Europe and Latin America. It showed that a people could rise up against an imperial power and fight for their rights. The success of the American Revolution, coupled with the ideas of Enlightenment thinkers like John Locke and Jean-Jacques Rousseau, provided a model for revolutionaries worldwide. The French Revolution, for instance, was directly inspired by the American fight for liberty and equality. Similarly, Latin American countries, inspired by the American and French revolutions, sought to break free from European colonial powers. The legacy of the American Revolution is a complex one. While the United States became a beacon for democratic ideals, the the road to realizing the promises of freedom and equality was long and fraught with contradictions. Yet, the revolution planted the seeds of a new world order, one that would be forever shaped by the pursuit of liberty, the rights of individuals, and the ideals of democracy. These principles continue to resonate around the world today, as the American Revolution remains a symbol of the enduring struggle for justice and equality.